Yeah, 2 for the both of the advantages he's gonna read.
I will make it very clear when you should switch sheets.
Cool.
The first advantage is going to be credibility, so you want to label it at the top in the middle. Just like right at the top of the page.
In what color?
One of them.
You fill my whole speech in one
I think
color.
it's called credibility. In one column or like
One color. And then their speech in the other. So you have different colors for the app and then
Are you permanent?
Yeah. No.
Wait.
Put it right in the center. No. That's why it's long. It's long so you can throw it on like this. But here you have like a lot of space.
Are you the affirmative?
Yeah.
Yes.
The negative.
I literally do not know what I'm doing.
Affirmative sufficient obvious.
Yeah, that's cool. Pen is so bad. No, stupid pen. Oh no!
Score pen.
No, it's gone. It's like 3 colors. This pen is like usually really nice.
I can't read. Bro, some people actually run the streets, they're scared change, and people are dead and change. Damn.
let's go.
Oh, that's so.
We just copy your key points and that's it.
Yeah. Well, you want to close. It's funny how I could do it.
Yo, look, I'm telling you, my flow is gonna be insane. You gonna look at my paper and see an author and a date.
I'll show you a breakdown later. Yeah.
Okay, so what's going on?
I have a flow up to watching videos.
And everyone still has their computer open, should it? Thanks, y'all.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright,
Wait a second.
we're gonna start.
Plan. The United States federal government should reduce direct commercial sales and foreign military sales of arms to Saudi Arabia from the United States. The first advantage is credibility. Saudi Arabia has an egregious track record of human rights abuses, and U.S. arms policy has justified continual violations. Geyer in 19. The Saudis are dependent on U.S. weapons, and it will be difficult for them to buy from Russia or China. The administration could continue military systems on Saudi behavior. The human rights agenda has never held Saudi to much of a standard. Activists are in prison. Some have been tortured or sexually assaulted. Trump continues to enable them, cracking down on dissent, including liberals, Shiites, and Sunnis. The president has power to sanction individuals who commit gross violations of human rights. Ending the Yemen war is empowering Al Qaeda and ISIS while exacerbating human tragedy that will lead to a generation to hate America for selling its weapons to Saudi. And current legislation is insufficient to prevent arms used in violation of human rights, but the AF reaffirms human rights commitments with a rebuke to Saudi Arabia. That's Hill in 17. A central tenet of pro-Saudi dogma is the sale of U.S. arms. Supporters argue that while governments that use them may be ugly, if they don't buy from us, they will buy from the Russians or the Chinese, and selling them our weapons gives greater say in how those weapons are used. But arms sales don't bring home the jobs, and clean energy and healthcare spending create 50% more jobs than the military. Treating values as negotiable is a slippery slope. U.S. law can come down in favor of values when Congress passed the FAA, banning security assistance to a government that engages in a pattern of violations of human rights. Security assistance should promote human rights. The ACEA set up procedures to regulate commercial arms sales. The Leahy Amendment forbids any equipping of a foreign security force if there is a credible evidence that there is gross violations of human rights. But this has failed miserably. Leahy is riddled with holes. The Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor is barely able to have the manpower to sift through the arms purchases, leaving foreign military sales almost unsupervised. Arms dealing in Saudi Arabia highlighted a deeper strain of U.S. policy that will outlast Trump. And the United States is a global model for human rights. Arms sales are a critical juncture in restoring credibility. That's Morgan in 18. The U.S. is the preeminent military power. It accelerated arms sales to governments with poor track records on human rights and signaled its intention to loosen restrictions on arms exports that would prioritize economic interests over values. Protecting national security at the expense of human rights forgets that long-term cost arms sales to Saudi Arabia is is a prime example of this harm. Human rights were always a key part of what defined the U.S. The U.S. is a champion. The loss of it is likely to create a leadership vacuum, and the countries that aim to fill it, China, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, will seek to spread their no-strings-attached approach to global affairs. Congress has already resisted a number of presidential initiatives in the interest of human rights. Congressional committees are using allocations and authorizations to impose sanctions, and human rights credibility is key to alliance credibility, promoting democracy, and it prevents a large-scale global war. Green in 17. U.S. leadership on democracy and human rights is the example that America sets. Countries appear less inhibited, assuming that Trump's election means they will get a free pass on rights violations, but by no means is it authoritarian retrenchment a new phenomenon. However, the U.S. served as a check on the worst impulses of our autocrats. Such regimes will likely go unchallenged as they commit egregious abuses and power grabs. This would have major security and economic consequences for the U.S. Democratic countries make the best and most stable partners. Emboldened dictators tend to pursue foreign policy that is destructive for the U.S. The liberal world order based on universal human rights, shared values, and the rule of law prevents large-scale conflict. No other country can substitute for the U.S. Solidarity by U.S. political and civil leaders has provided sustenance of hope to human rights defenders in the grimmest conditions. And human rights credibility solves global WMD conflict. That's Burke, White, and 4. Promotion of human rights should be given a more prominent place in U.S. foreign policy. Chief threats to national security are aggression by other states. Evidence indicates that states that abuse human rights are likely to engage in aggression. Improvements in human rights decrease the likelihood of war. Policy informed by human rights can significantly enhance global security. Human rights are a telling indicator that provides a powerful new tool to enhance national security through the promotion of human rights. It addresses the threat of states obtaining WMDs. And next contention. The next contention is Middle East instability. Scenario 1 is Iran. The plan is key to stopping co-production deals that allow Saudi Arabia to produce smart bombs. That leads to regional instability and Middle East arms racing. That's DeLuce and Windrum in 19. Arms deal for our Arab allies will allow U.S. bomb parts to be manufactured in Saudi Arabia. The deal opens the door for Saudi production of paveway precision-guided munitions. The Trump administration defended the sale as a way to ensure allies can defend themselves amid danger from Iran. Assembly in the kingdom raised security and proliferation questions for the U.S. If they can master the production, they could sell it. And U.S. THAAD sales to Saudi Arabia are coming now. Tehran in 19. The U.S. Defense Department announced it awarded a contract to begin a THAAD package for Saudi Arabia. The kingdom is to receive 44 THAAD batteries, and THAAD purchases by Saudi Arabia fuel Iranian military modernization that triggers Iran prolif. Stein in 19. The BMD prompted Iranian countermoves to ensure that missiles can defeat U.S.-made defenses. Tehran is investing in short and medium-range missiles when fired in large numbers would overwhelm the smaller missile defense systems deployed. And interesting in developing late-stage manufacturing capabilities to defend and defeat terminal missile defense remains Iran's interest. It may be indicative of a missile race in the region. Each side's effort prompts technological developments to offset any advantage. The American effort to make regional defenses more capable is destined to invite countermoves by Iran. Missile race could destabilize region rife with conflict, and nuclear exchanges are likely. Iran prolif uniquely guarantees it. That's Schlosser in 14. An Iran armed with nuclear weapons would pose a grave threat, and the fact that a nuclear catastrophe hasn't occurred reveals nothing about the future. Political instability has been a source of catastrophe. Split-second decision-making has brought the world closer to a nuclear war. Iran was racked by demo. Even with the best intentions, the unreliability of communication systems can precipitate disaster. Given Iran's technical, political, and leadership challenges, its pursuit of nuclear weapons seems to an invitation to disaster. And arms sales to Saudi fuels Iranian threat construction that enables Saudi adventurism. That's Weisman in 18. Saudi is no longer just stocking up weapons, it is using them in Yemen. Preparations for the future of armed forces, a motive for the militarization of the region. It could perceive Yemen as preventing the takeover by Iran. Perceptions that enhance the reach of its forces may embolden Saudi leadership to view the force as an essential part of its foreign policy and responses to perceived threats and major risks for security, stability, and peace. And Iran-Saudi war goes nuclear. That's Stinson in 15. A nuclear Saudi would be dangerous. Saudi Arabia's history of political instability would leave the security of the arsenal in doubt. Saudi nukes would be aimed at Iran, but Saudi supported terrorism is more apocalyptic than its Shia counterpart. A Saudi nuke would tempt Iran to launch a preemptive war against Saudi Arabia. A war would have dire consequences for the world. To avoid prolif, America must solve Saudi a security dilemma. And arms embargoes block Saudi's warfare in Yemen. Yemen. Anything else is an enough to reform Saudi's behavior. That's Goodman in 18. Threatening support for Saudi Arabia's war machine can serve a variety of purposes. The message needs to be that the relationship is frozen unless MBS moves aside. The U.S. is an enabler of the war. If the U.S. decided to cut off supplies, munitions, intelligence, and everything else to the Royal Saudi Air Force, it would be grounded tomorrow. And the clean break from the U.S. military support a more targeted effort to police that support, placing limits on future foreign military sales. The relationship has gotten off track, and the need for serious consequences could be used to extricate ourselves from military involvement in Yemen. That would signal us to the Saudis that assistance will become contingent on progress.
What?
This you can.
Look, you're supposed to follow that. This is what I got.
Or he's supposed to throw like.
Damn, this is.
You're not supposed to flow these things. You're supposed to throw them. You flow in columns.
I'm
Like
confused.
flow in columns.
What do you guys write? What do you guys have?
Damn, she like.
Wait, can I see it? So I
She knows the way.
know what to actually do next time. Well, I don't know if this is right. It's not. I mean, I didn't flow properly. Like I didn't flow each part. Like I did both things in one. You need flowing.
Don't allow new weapons.
Yeah,
This is why you don't need big paper.
why can't we just,
about flowing.
why can't we just type it?
Yeah.
I hate it. It's fun.
You can't hear the beginning of the card.
I feel like he just spit
Well, then you can always
Eminem
ask for
grabbed
the
that for like 8 minutes.
I have a question. Can you ask for a card?
This is what I
Like
got.
the beginning.
This
So a lot of
corner
times during round,
string.
you will have a lot of
Was
their
all
document in
from
front of
both
you,
ways?
and if you need clarification, you can either ask that like kind of before process, like if they read a card that you don't see, you can say, hey, can I get that card? Otherwise, during process, you can say, you know, like what does this card exactly say? If you need more of a clarification like that.
Yeah, like, I don't know if you heard, but I asked him like where he stopped, because he stopped before he finished his document, so you can do things like that.
Wait, I know we're not supposed to ask questions, but is this the like set evidence that they're gonna give us, or that you're reading, or is this
This
your?
is a starter pack.
Oh,
yeah.
cool.
So this is all stuff that you'll be reading.
Yeah. When do we get there?
Hopefully soon.
Because they start. Oh. Bro.
You talking really fast?
Yeah.
That is not fast.
No, we're gonna do process.
Yours was not that fast.
Alright. All ready?
Don't slow process.
Okay.
There's a different sheet of paper.
First,
You don't have to
Flow
put
process.
you can if you want to, just to like, you know, write down what you want.
You'd
You
put
don't
it-
have to in debate. For now, don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, so your first advantage, you say that human rights credibility is key to sort of democratic promotion and ending war. How are you able to sort of measure that, and what level of human rights credibility does a country need to be able to effectively do that?
To measure reducing war, or
Yeah, and like promoting democracy, like
I think
how much is
democracy promotion is-
credible?
democracy promotion is evident in the autocratic dictatorships that have been proven to fill in. While I can't provide the numeric offhand, the evidence of foreign policy decisions, including military adventurism overseas and the renouncement of like bilateral and multilateral international organizations.
The next question I sort of have, the first card on the app identifies Saudi Arabia as having a bunch of human rights abuses.
Yeah.
Does the app sort of claim to provide a model that Saudi Arabia then follows as a country that now all of a sudden ends these abuses? Or how does that work?
Well, I think that method is what the app is criticizing, because we don't think that Saudi Arabia is intent on just simply modeling U.S. decision making, but rather they need to be coerced into those decisions, and that is what the app provides.
Okay, so the app reaffirms that the U.S. super duper cares about human rights commitments by saying we aren't going to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, basically.
Rather that, yes.
Okay, so I guess like why are arms sales to Saudi Arabia specifically so important to U.S. human rights credibility when there are things like the U.S. does, like Guantanamo Bay, or like shady CIA black sites that, you know, torture people? Why are those not seen as a greater hit on U.S. human rights credibility
Yes.
than arms sales to one specific country.
If you give me 1 second, I think it's the Margin card that says, despite anything that we do, America holds a unique place internationally and is seen as a leader on human rights. No matter what we actually do, the signaling of the U.S. is such that as the global hyperpower, we are seen as a tenant.
Sure. I guess if that is the case, why exactly is it so important for U.S. credibility to be higher by like ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia? If the U.S. is already seen as so important and elite.
I guess there's a lot of reasons. For one, it's important for international credibility with alliances. For another, arms sales to Saudi Arabia create a model where we would sell to unstable, rogue, or potentially harmful dictatorships.
Why would
which could come back
the
to
U.S.
bite us
do
later
that
on.
if that would be like creating security concerns?
Trump has already expressed his interest in doing so.
You don't have evidence.
It's the Hill card, I think. It says values are negotiable.
I have a question. Wait, so during cross-ex, is it like, if you're the person asking the question, if you're like done hearing their answer, can you say, okay, thank you, and then like go on to your next question?
Yeah. I mean, there's like a level to it. It's definitely hard to sort of get sometimes because you will definitely have debates where people will just keep talking and talking and talking, and it's just like you can be like, okay, I have another question, or like I have a limited amount of time, I need to move on to another question. And some people, you know, they'll be. Sometimes you gotta be a little bit more pushy. But for the most part, just
So there's going to be, okay, so the order of my speech is going to be 3 off, so it's going to be the 3 new sheets of paper. And then it's going to be the credibility advantage, and then the Middle East advantage.
So when you talk about the I don't know. But when you talk about the advantages, you just go in a different color.
Yes. And you should do that. Yeah, you should be using a different colored pen for all 3 sheets of paper for the negative arguments, right?
Oh, so 3 colors.
No, you should have 2 colors total. So 1 for the negative team, 1 for the affirmative team.
Okay, that's easier.
Yeah. So whenever me and Logan talk, use 1 color. Whenever those 2 talk, use another. So, by the way, normally they won't say like way before, but I'm going to because this is like learning experience. So the first argument is going to be the 2020 disad. That's going to be on 1 sheet, yep. Alright. So the next argument is going to be on the conditions counterplan. Conditions CP. The same color, different sheets of paper for those 2 arguments, yeah. Alright.
Me too.
Alright, and then the third and the last off case argument is going to be the Iran deterrence disad.
Almost rated it.
So close just for you and your school.
I'm using the same color.
Oh, counterweights to paper like that. Use regular sheets. You know what you can do? You can cut it in half.
Actually, well, what if somebody speaks like has a lot to say instead of like sounding with the acronym?
Yes,
So, is everybody ready? So the order is going to be the 2020 DA, the conditions counterplan, the Iran deterrence DA, then it's going to be the credibility advantage, then the Middle East advantage. Does everybody like have their papers in that order?
Okay, it's after Iran is what? Oh.
So after the Iran deterrence DA is going to be the piece of paper they had, which is going to be the credibility advantage, and then human. What was the question over there? Yeah, so you're going to need the 2 pieces of paper you use for them for my speech.
Wait, hold up.
Does that make sense?
I still have no clue.
Yeah, okay.
2020 disadvantage, conditions counterplan, the Iran deterrence disadvantage.
Yes, and then the two pieces of paper you used for the first speech, you're going to use again because I'm going to make arguments on the arguments they made. Does that make sense? Okay.
So we use 2 different sheets, right?
So you're going to need, so there's going to be 5 different pieces of paper total. 3 of them are mine, 2 of them are theirs.
I'm messed up. What was the first one? What was the first two?
Okay, so the order one more time is going to be 2020 disad. Then it's going to be the conditions counter plan. Then it's going to be the Iran deterrence disad. Then after that, it's going to be the human rights credibility advantage.
There's this song.
And then the last, what? Yeah, it's the one that he said already.
They like say a bunch of words really fast.
This was in the first speech.
So just like learn how to play.
Oh, that's right. You weren't here for the first speech. Yeah. So human rights credibility advantage, and the last one is going to be the Middle East advantage. Middle East advantage.
The one about Iran?
Yeah, that's the one that's about Iran.
Middle East advantage?
So he
Yes.
did what he did 2, you're going
And human rights credibility, disadvantage, or advantage?
What?
Human rights.
Yeah.
So he did 2.
So he was on 2 sheets of paper for the 1AC. I'm going to be on 5 sheets of paper. 3 of them are going to be my arguments, which are offensive, and then 2 of them are just going to be responding to things that were said in the 1AC.
This is negative speaking.
This is the negative speaking, yes. So affirmative goes first, then. So, do y'all think you're ready?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, are you as ready as you're gonna be?
Yes.
Okay. You should try and use a different color than you did for the first. So, yeah. All right.
Debates are an hour and a half without interruption.
Yeah.
No, it's all right. This is a learning experience.
We
You
have
got
2
it.
hours set for this.
We have 3 hours set for this, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, my friend likes me.
So yeah, feel free to ask questions. So, all right, everybody, y'all are as ready as you're gonna be.
Sure.
All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
2020 dissent, yeah. First off is a 2020 dissent. Dems still hold the lead in 2020, but it's tight. Rothenberg 611. A plurality of Americans believe the country cannot take another 4 years. 2020 looks to be a referendum on the president. A close race is likely given Trump's inability to broaden his appeal. The Dem ticket deserves a narrow advantage. And Dems are criticizing Trump's Middle East strategy to gain votes. The AF ruins that. Rios 19. Trump declared an emergency to push through an arms deal with Saudi Arabia. The moves have drawn backlash from candidates. Sanders criticized the workaround for Khashoggi. Biden criticized Trump for having no foreign policy. And withdrawal from Paris will be decided in 2020. Staying prevents extinction-level warming. Schlanger 17. U.S. emits 1/6 of emissions. The decision to remove U.S. commitments to reduce and avoid levels of temperature rise that imperil viability, life on Earth. Trump will abide by the real question of whether the country stays in the Paris may be decided in 2020 election. The pledge is symbolically important. Assurances that the country would take responsibility for its emissions without U.S. participation during critical years. Hopes of avoiding dangerous climate change slips away. And warming causes extinction. Stone 11. Evidence confirming anthropogenic warming has surpassed doubt. Changes are elevating ecosystem stress, ocean acidification that endangers the food web, perturbations threaten water and agricultural and habitats for human populations, exacerbating problems of poverty and growth, and undermining stability globally. They constitute an irreversible threat to the survival of human civilization. Human activities drive up GHG, forcing climate toward irreversible tipping points. Assessments by NAS, NRC, and the IPCC that human activities account for warming. Mitigation is a planetary imperative. And next off is the conditions counterplan. Text: the United States should continue direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia if they agree to cease intervention in the Republic of Yemen civil war unless the Houthi movement refuses to partake in peace talks with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Condition forces Saudi Arabia's hand and solves the AF, Cholet, and Goldenberg 18. The crisis is forcing the U.S. to reassess the relationship with Saudi. The U.S. must offer a choice defined by no intervention in Yemen, no fighting with Qatar, and no surprises. Saudi needs the U.S. Washington needs to be consulted on initiatives. Washington should demand Saudi work toward a political solution. In exchange for Saudi's shift, the U.S. would maintain military support. And the next off is the Iran deterrence decide. Arms sales underpin the U.S.-Saudi alliance, which is key to deter aggression from Iran and great power competitors. They shut down critical shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz and Heinrichs 18. Saudi is the largest customer of sales because Saudi is a counterweight to Iran. Iran is a destabilizing force. That war exists because Iran is funding the Houthi rebels. Saudi is our most important partner in mitigating Iran's power and malign activities. Saudi leads the Gulf in maritime security to keep shipping lanes open. Should the U.S. lose control of those, Iran would be empowered to coerce the U.S. Ending arms sales with Saudi would play to America's enemies. And that tanks the global economy, Friedman 12. Blockading Hormuz, through which 20% of oil passes, failing to deter, they might close off, temporarily disrupting, even intermittently, could rapidly create a global crisis given the fragility of the world economy. And economic decline causes nuclear war, Tonneson 15. Decisions for war are taken by people who act on the basis of future expectations. If leaders anticipate decline, they may blame external dependence, appeal to anti-foreign sentiments, contemplate force about protectionist policies, and refuse to be deterred by nuclear arms. Such a dangerous shift could happen abruptly. Changes in the world economy render interstate peace precarious. Deterrence could lose its credibility, and great powers might gamble that the other yield. And, on to case, the credibility advantage. Trump terminally dooms leadership, but even post-Trump, the U.S. is totally ineffective. Byman 18. Even if the U.S. had expertise, improving governance requires patience and sustainable programs, not strong points for the U.S. Reducing corruption takes steady funding and political support. This was plausible during the Cold War under a bipartisan consensus. The Cold War is gone, and opponents of intervention are increasingly influential. Trump's aversion to shithole countries suggests the U.S. is less willing to do the hard work of governance. Counterterrorism itself is an impediment. The U.S. is more likely to work with warlords who will kill terrorists, prioritizing counterterrorism, tolerating corruption, and human rights abuses. And U.S.-Saudi defense relationship encourages Saudi to engage in human rights reform, Whiten 18. By keeping a working relationship with Saudi, we can urge the country down its path of reform. And ending arms sales won't influence Saudi policies, empirics prove, Basaccio 18. A shutdown of U.S. arms cooperation with Saudi would come with risks. If the administration's goal is to isolate Iran, coordination with Saudi will prove essential. Cutting defense cooperation could produce the opposite effect. Saudi could double down. The U.S. response to Sisi cut arms cooperation. The U.S. rescinded the policy, having made no progress. Saudi might perceive U.S. actions as hostile. And on to the Middle East advantage. Acquisitions of THAAD and other missile defense systems are inevitable in the region, Dowd 17. The U.S. and GCC agreed to a missile defense capability. The UAE was the first to purchase a THAAD battery. Qatar announced plans to purchase THAAD systems. Missile defense has gone mainstream. And Saudi and Iran won't go to war, the Booth 16. Saudi Arabia and Iran will not go to war. Saudi does not have the capacity to go to war with Iran. It does not have serious ground troops. It is unlikely that Egypt will go to war with Iran only because of the Sunni link. Iran and Saudi know a military confrontation would plunge the region. Would be catastrophe. Real war would be catastrophe for both countries' ambitions. And democracy promotion fails, Walt 16. Efforts at democracy promotion not fared well. Visible failures in Libya, Yemen, and Iraq, backsliding in Turkey, Hungary, democratic dysfunctions in the EU and US. Creating effective democracy took centuries and it was a contentious process. Nationalism remains powerful features. People dislike following orders. Groups that have lost power tempted to take up arms. There is no reliable way for democratic transition when the country in question contains deep social divisions. Prison population is the world's largest. Public infrastructure are decaying. Moneyed interests exert a disproportionate and toxic effect. Other societies find America's professed ideals less appealing. Guantanamo, targeted killings, NSA surveillance, and can't stop nuclear tech transfers, which are a major alt cause to regional prolif, Roberts 19. Trump is bypassing Congress to advance nuclear power plants to Saudi. The tech would allow Saudi to produce nuclear weapons. White House attempts to speed the transfer. Saudi's nuclear power will push Iran to restart its program. And local arms production faces a myriad of challenges, Stratford 18. It is one thing to agree to tech transfers, but another to implement deals. Struggles to satisfy stipulations that mandate sourcing of services led to contract delays. It has proved difficult to set up in Saudi. A particular problem has been finding a sufficient number of Saudis who have the skills and willingness to work on a factory floor. Now, I have over a minute left, but since I don't have any more cards for you for the speech, I'm going to end early. Do not do that in y'all's debates. This is just for dumb. All right. Yeah, you have a question?
I didn't write much.
So usually you'll have your partner will like bring you new cards. I wasn't going to do that for this debate in particular because it's like a demonstration debate. I wanted to like sort of see, but normally like whoever like the chew-in in the partnership would probably bring up like more cards to read on case.
Yeah, and if you're
In
the
a real
one,
debate before, like you said these things, would you have it, would they let you write down like what you have in topics on the paper?
What?
Like in a real debate, would you tell us what the topics were beforehand so we could write down notes or not?
Well, you write down notes during the speech. Oh, but no, in a real debate, you mean like when I say 2020 DA at the top? Or, no,
Yeah.
normally in a real debate for the 1 and C, I would say 3 off, then I would list the actual advantages. So I'd say 3 off, then human rights, credibility, then Middle East.
No, like before you started, would you say like 2020 disadvantages?
Oh, during my speech, I would. But I wouldn't say it like before my speech. That makes sense. I'd say 3 off, then case, and then I'd be like, first off is a 2020 disad, then I'd start, and then it'd be like second off is condition CP, then I'd keep going. In every other speech but the 1 and C though, like the 2AC should say exactly what pages they're going to, in which order, etc. Yeah. So yeah, those are like the different positions that each team is defending.
It's not like mandatory to have 3, right? People can have like way more than that too, right?
Yeah, I've read up to 10 in a debate before.
So that means you need 10 sheets of paper.
That means you need a 10 sheets of paper plus everything. Yeah, but like normally I've seen it's about 4.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Does ATM work for you?
All right. So if there's no more questions, we'll do our
Does your ATM work?
cross-ex. All right, cross-ex.
You're good?
Yeah.
ATM work?
Well, yeah, we'll do question. So it's on a technical sense, it's open, but like the 1A should be giving the cross-ex to the 1 and C. Like occasionally, if the 2A has like a specific clarification question, it's okay to ask, or if there's something like that my partner is more knowledgeable about for them to answer, I might like be like, actually, my partner is more knowledgeable in this position. They'll answer your question, but otherwise, it should be like 1A to 1N.
yeah, generally speaking, the person that is immediately giving the next speech should be prepping the whole time.
Yeah. And to be clear, in high school, sometimes there's like different rules depending on the tournament. So just make sure you know those going in, because there are tournaments that only want closed cross-ex. Yeah.
Also, do we open closed?
So open is like everybody is technically allowed to talk. Closed is like only the person who gave the speech and the person asking questions are allowed to talk. The other two should be silent. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, Nick, I'm ready.
All right, cool. I guess we can start on the counterplan. What's the net benefit?
The net benefit to the counterplan is both 2020 and ERA deterrence.
Okay. And what's the status?
Status quo is always a logical option.
Okay. You said the U.S. is ineffective and that the warrant is decreasing corruption. What does that do to change U.S. credibility?
I believe the card you're referencing is probably the Biden evidence list that specific actions that Trump has taken has made U.S. democracy look particularly unappealing. I mean, I guess I'm confused on what your question is. Like,
okay,
we have a laundry list of different warrants, like I believe it listed Guantanamo and other like targeted killings as things that make U.S. democracy unappealing to other countries, so they have like no necessity.
That's fine. I guess when it makes democracy unappealing to other countries, does that affect individuals, or does your card speak to how individuals perceive U.S. credibility on human rights?
It doesn't matter how individuals perceive U.S. credibility or advantages about like countries modeling U.S. actions, which they obviously would not do, because like the U.S. would look like big hypocrites, like, oh, Saudi has a bad human rights record. They're gonna be like, what about y'all?
All right. What's the warrant for a no Iran Saudi war?
It specifically says that Saudi literally does not have the capacity to go to war. They don't have enough ground troops. It also shows that both sides have an incentive to avoid war because they know that it's not.
People getting into stupid and ill-advised wars isn't like the first time in history. I'm just curious why or what the warrant is for why they specifically won't. Just because it's a bad idea.
Yeah, the warrants are the two things I just listed. Like Saudi Arabia literally cannot initiate war because they don't have the ground troops, and our evidence also says that other regional countries that could partner with them will refuse to do so because like the link between them isn't strong enough. Like it's like against all countries' interests.
The nuclear power argument you made at the bottom. You said that nuclear power plants can produce nuclear weapons. Only breeder reactors produce nuclear weapons. What's the warrant for how?
No, our evidence specifically says that Trump is like giving nuclear power plants to Saudi and that the technology And it's specifically citing security analysts, by the way, that the technology that we give them would allow them to produce nuclear weapons. You have not read, none of the evidence the 1AC counters this yet.
Okay, and the Waltz card, I guess why why is nationalism and social division uniquely high now?
I don't see where the Waltz.
Sorry, that was under the Saudi and Iran war card.
Oh, okay. What was your question again? Sorry.
Just like, why is nationalism high now?
Probably because of Trump's election, lots of reasons. I can't speak to that particularly, but U.S. actions definitely haven't helped.
Okay. It's slow down.
That's slow. That's really
Professional
I can talk with people.
For if you go to other rounds, they talk faster.
So don't write everything down word for word. Write down acronyms. Instead of writing disadvantage, write DA.
I just wrote 2020 press from Parents Club.
Hey, it's in New York Times. What? But yeah, I'm so tall.
Brain is
Somebody
swelling.
explain it to me.
Well, like, so you know, tomorrow morning, I'm
Yeah, well.
Wait, what are you saying?
Nuclear power plants, I think
It's uranium. They start to make that uranium.
Red tea with blue
Wait, yeah, how did that, I find that.
Any country can be outside, alright?
Oh, yeah, oh,
Any country can be.
So giving arms to Saudi Arabia strengthens Trump, which is bad because he's gonna cause extinction. It's so bad. I get
This is
It's
so
the
dumb.
initial part.
It took me a while to understand that. I was talking about climate change. I'm talking about climate change. I thought we were talking about arms sales.
Alright, y'all good? I'll give you the order. Yeah, I know. Alright, so your order for your flows, it's gonna be the credibility advantage, and then it's gonna be, what? Yeah. Every speech, almost every speech will go back to the same flows, but Middle East stability, the Iran advantage, the conditions counterplan, 2020 and then the deterrence DA.
Wait a minute, say it over?
Yes.
Yep. So credibility, the Middle East Iran advantage from the app, so it should start with whatever color the same credibility. And then it's going to be the conditions counterplan, the 2020 disad, and then the deterrence disad.
Okay.
All right. That sound good about it?
Why is it so cold?
It's cold. Yeah, you can turn off the fan if you want.
No, please don't turn off the fan. Dude, it was summer.
You can just unplug it.
No,
it's like
my papers file. You know what the most satisfying?
It is cold.
Okay. Y'all good? All right. The U.S.-backed Saudi intervention in Yemen is causing massive human rights abuses, and it's up to the U.S. to use its influence to control Saudi Arabia. Their Biden card doesn't answer the core internal link to the credit advantage because it doesn't say anything about Trump decking a human rights leadership. The U.S. is still key. If their Witten card was true, we would have seen Saudi Arabia pulling out of Yemen, but that hasn't happened, so it's try or die for the affirmative. Arms sales are a bargaining chip to force Saudi Arabia on reforms on human rights. Way and 18. The president has it wrong when he argues that the U.S. would be foolish to try and use these sales as leverage. In fact, it's one of the biggest bargaining chips he has with the kingdom. It doesn't have an arms industry. Saudi Arabia imports most of its arms from other countries. Saudi Arabia has imported more armaments than every country. The claim that U.S. weapons can be easily replaced with suppliers does not. The cost to switch to a different supplier can be huge. After being so reliant on U.S. weapon systems for decades, the transition costs being prohibitive. Even oil-rich Saudi Arabia to maintain its military superiority in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has opted to purchase virtually all weapons from American companies. That is why the U.S. has significant leverage, and any Saudi threat to retaliate would not be credible. Now on to the Middle East stability advantage. Our internal link rests on the fact that Saudi Arabia would be obtaining THAAD batteries from the U.S., which fuels Iranian proliferation. It doesn't matter if other countries somehow attain THAAD batteries. Iran is uniquely concerned about the U.S. Arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and their DeBoof card doesn't apply. It only says that Saudi Arabia and Iran won't go to war because Saudi Arabia doesn't have the military capabilities, which is exactly what they would be getting absent the plan. Now, arms sales to Saudi Arabia are also the key internal link into democracy promotion. Saudi Arabia is engaging in massive human rights abuses in the status quo, such as the Yemen humanitarian crisis, creating one of the biggest famines in history. Even if this isn't the only form of human rights or democracy promotion, it is a step in the right direction. It is enough to be able to solve Middle East instability, which is the only thing we need to be able to win this round. And there's also no proof that Trump would engage in nuclear tech transfers. Either way, this would take years to accomplish. Any abrupt end in arms transfers would solve our impacts and restore stability and lead to an end in the Yemen humanitarian crisis. And co-production is true. Saudi Arabia would have access to all the tech needed to create smart bombs. The Trump administration has directly encouraged co-production. Even if they win, that local production faces a lot of challenges. Our internal link relies on the perception that Saudi Arabia has acquired the tech needed to create these bombs and fuels Iranian proliferation. And I'm going to skip the card. And on to the conditions counterplan. The first argument here is perm do both. The second argument is Saudi interventions in Yemen are directly fueled by U.S. weapons. The counterplan alone reaffirms a relationship that causes human rights atrocities. This is Christian and 19. No reason to believe that Saudi intervention has minimized the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Observers agree that the opposite is true. U.S. backing of Saudi intervention has exacerbated the situation. U.S. assistance to the Saudi includes voluminous sales of arms. With Washington's help, the Saudi coalition has also launched strikes on civilian targets. Withdrawal of U.S. support could encourage Saudi to seek a quick resolution. And this third argument is the counterplan condition is unmet now. Houthis will not agree to peace talks, no incentives, lack of fear from international backlash, and a distrust of Saudi Arabia wreck talks. Al-Wahri and 19. Yemen's president suspended talks with the UN. Failure has come at no surprise to Yemenis. The international community was favoring political expediency over addressing the conflict's root causes. The Houthis have no incentive to implement the agreement and have learned from their experience with the international community do not feel repercussions for violating it. This will not happen unless a genuine pressure is exerted on the Saudi-led coalition. And condition counterplans are a voting issue. First, they fiat moving targets. The outcome of the counterplan is never a stable adequacy, which kills our ability to generate offense. Second, not predictable. There's an infinite number of conditions: ceasing intervention, ceasing weapon development, increasing diplomatic standards, etc. And three, time frame fiat. This makes delay CP, which means the act can never win. So you're going to err act. We grant them the right to counterplans and even plan inclusive counterplans, but condition counterplans are uniquely bad. Now on to the 2020 disad. The first argument here is that there's no impact, no warming extinction. It can't solve adaptation checks, and it's locked in. Farquhar and 17. Levels of warming are unlikely to cause human extinction. Impossible to say at what point warming would be severe enough to pose an existential threat. Time scales over which changes might happen mean humanity is able to adapt to avoid extinction in very extreme scenarios. It is suspected that 40% of the peak of CO2 will remain in the atmosphere for 1,000 years after the peak is reached. It's impossible to reduce temperatures quickly by reducing CO2 emissions. The second argument is Trump is winning 2020 now. This is Ratner and 19. The economy ranks at the top issues in presidential election. It appears to offer Trump a meaningful tailwind. Economists have developed models for predicting election outcomes. It should be quite large. He also found that incumbency was an important determinant of presidential election outcomes. The FAIR model has done remarkably well. Incumbency will be a tailwind for Trump. The economy will also be helpful. Looked at 12 models, and Trump wins all of them. And it's too early to predict. Polling is highly variable and this early in the cycle. Rechtchick and 19. Polls at this point frequently fail to predict the actual outcome. There is too much time in which major race-changing events such as the 2008 financial crash can take place. And key issues in the election outweigh arms control. Agitza and Sparks 610. Majorities can say any candidate who hopes to win must favor a women's right to abortion, recognize climate change, and support restoration of ban assault weapons and other issues such as Medicare for all, free tuition, and restoration of felon voting rights are must-haves. And now on the link turn, the plan is key to rebuke Trump and sets the stage for a 2020 victory. Deherman and 19. Congress is poised to pass its first ordering an end to U.S. involvement and rebuking Trump's embrace of Saudi Arabia and handing Democrats a vital component of the strategy and challenging him in 2020. Trump's strained relations with allies and his unpredictable approach to the Middle East have triggered broad bipartisan efforts to its blunt action. Foreign policy is not traditionally a marquee campaign issue, but such votes on Capitol Hill matter, and the set agenda for the party as a whole. National security is a huge opportunity for Democrats in 2020. If we don't run a candidate who wants to talk about foreign policy, we're missing an opportunity. Democrats have taken it to the campaign trail. Saudi Arabia is clearly a country inspired by Trump. Experienced Democrat strategists are urging party candidates to make Trump's dealings with a litmus test. It puts on display what Americans really detest about Trump. And now onto the deterrence. Disad. The first argument here is that there's no impact to economic decline. Countries respond with cooperation, not conflict. Clarion 15. Economic crises lead to conciliatory behavior. Austerity pressures incent leaders to cut defense, encourage strategic reassessment, lead to threat deflation, threat prioritization. Crisis increase in political and economic benefit from cooperation. Leaders seek aid, trade, investment, and it's easier if tensions are reduced. Elites select heterodox foreign policy. These will prefer conciliatory policies. And the new arms deals are the key internal link to destabilizing the Middle East, the blade in 19. Iranian officials lashed out at the U.S. after Trump said it would allow the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Analysts said that officials in Tehran were likely to see it as a further deterioration in relations between the two countries. On May 19th, a rocket was fired into Baghdad's heavily fortified green zone, and Iran wouldn't be able to close the strait for more than a few days. Lockheed in 18, Iran's military wouldn't last more than a few days against the U.S. and its allies. Iran must know this, and it's likely bluffing that they have in the past threats to close the strait. Iran would quickly find a waterway unmanned. It fast attacked at the craft at the bottom of the strait, and its coastal missile batteries destroyed. And we access the best internal link into this advantage. We directly control Iranian proliferation through the arms sales with Saudi Arabia. And so the plan is going to be able to solve the impact of this disadvantage much faster than the status quo would. I'm open for questions.
Any questions from the all quickly?
Yeah. Questions?
How do you process that?
Yeah, I know. I went a little faster than everyone else, but
A little?
a little. I try to slow down on the tags. Gotta get used to it. People are gonna start talking fast.
Just like a thing.
That was what the judge
The judge will understand.
A thing broadly for flowing. Most of the time, what you want to be able to write down at the very least is just the tag of the argument. You can always go back. Because nearly all of the time you will have the evidence in front of you in an actual debate. So if you have the tag down and you're unsure about what an argument is or what was said, if they're unclear or whatever, if they're going fast, you can always mark down on your flow the tag, like make a star or something, and then go back and read the actual evidence after that. But the important thing with flowing is just sort of having almost like a bridge, little quick checklist of like what you know, the arguments they're making.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And most people, like, even if people do, because you will kind of in your first couple of years of policy debate, you will encounter people that are going to be a lot faster than you because they have, you know, it's a skill that you build up. And so even if they are going fast, they should be slowing down on the tags like I tried to do. So when I say like arms sales are a bargaining chip to force Saudi reforms on human rights, and then I say the author, Gway in 18, and then I start going a little faster in the actual like substance and the article part of it. So that you can at least like write down that first tag, because then you're getting the thesis of that argument, and then you'll usually have the cards in front of you so that if you miss something while they're reading, you can kind of read through it yourself. Make sense? Okay.
Oh, yeah, you have that in front of you.
Yeah. All right. Is everybody ready for cross-ex? Most of you.
Yeah.
All right. What were the theoretical reasons to reject the game?
Conditions counter plans are awful for debate.
Okay, so it's only conditions counterplan.
Only conditions counter plan.
Awesome. And what firms did you make?
Just perm do both.
Just cool. So I want to talk about the first piece of evidence you read, like the Gway evidence. It says that arms sales are a bargaining chip for human rights. I am really confused on why this isn't just an advocate for the counter plan and how it's an app card.
Right. So the bargaining chip, the problem with the counter plan here is that the conditions are like never going to be met because you have this like extra condition, like unless they are not going to comply, then Saudi Arabia doesn't really have to like do anything to like quell this humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And so we have one of the best bargaining chips in terms of just pulling out of all arms sales to Saudi Arabia is the best bargaining chip because it forces them to the negotiating table rather than just saying, well, if they don't comply, then you don't really have to do
I guess
anything.
I'm just kind of confused on that. So your plan passes immediately and it passes permanently, and it just says we are no longer going to give arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Why do they now look at this and change their actions if you're inevitably not going to give them arms?
Right, because I mean, there's obviously like other diplomatic reasons that they would be forced to because arms sales are a huge boost to their economy, but there are other ways that we can give them boost their economy by either like investing more in their oil companies and things like that. So these are the like things that they're going to be able to negotiate when they are forced to the negotiating table.
To be clear, your argument is like they're going to be like, oh snap, we just lost all of our weapon systems. But they said they're going to invest more in oil, so we're going to end the war in Yemen.
I mean, that's one scenario, I guess. It just forces them to the negotiating table.
All right, awesome. I'm going to mess up pronouncing this, but the link to an art card you read on the 2020 DA, it just says that like talking about foreign policy is key. Like, why is that distinct?
No, it actually specifically talks about how the Democrats rebuking Trump is going to get a lot of like swing voters and those more conservative Democratic voters because this is a bipartisan plan that has already been talked about in Congress, and so being able to actually pass this.
Your evidence like specifically talks about how like Dems are like sort of campaigning on like these foreign policy issues, which is literally our platforming link. Why don't you just like, because we assume your plan like passes by normal means, why doesn't it just doesn't this?
Okay, so then there's either a double bind there, like either our plan acts as a link turn, or Trump winning 2020 is going to be inevitable because like Dems are already platforming, they're already campaigning on this. It's already been talked about in Congress.
Okay, I guess my last question will be like the Lockheed evidence you read, like it's the very last card in the file. It just says that the U.S. and allies would in fact intervene if Iran blocks this way. Why doesn't this just?
Wait, so like in like the first speech, like do you not have to like really like go through what the issue, like state out like what the issue is like a lot, like you don't have to spend a lot of time like stating like I don't know how to word this, but like you don't you don't exactly define like the Yemen humanitarian crisis, like it's kind of
so
you just like assume that everything.
I'm using that because Yemen was originally in our doc, but I'm using that as an example because our first advantage talks a lot about like Saudi Arabia human rights abuses, and so the biggest one that what comes to mind when people think of Saudi Arabia human rights abuses is Yemen, and so it's talked about in our evidence a little bit more than it is explicitly talked about in our like tags, and so it's used mostly as an example in this debate.
So like my question is like in policy debate, you don't have to like talk like a lot about what it is exactly. You can just use it as like you don't talk about like a lot about what those are. Like I mentioned, like I think there was mentioned like sexual abuse and something and like violence, but
yeah. So you're talking about like what specifically is going on in Yemen.
So like yeah, you don't have to say that, right? Like,
I mean, you don't necessarily have to. I mean, it kind of depends. Like that's more if we were talking more on like the impact level of what's going on in Yemen, then that is definitely something that we would be talking about. But we're kind of talking about human rights abuses in the abstract, and they haven't really pushed back on like what's going on in Yemen because obviously there's atrocities going on, and so since they're they're obviously not saying oh Yemen's fine, so we don't really have to like go deeper in on like what all is going on. Does that make sense?
Alright, one more question. Just one more.
So like you said like there was a voting issue and then you said like fiat.
Yeah, so I think that if you're talking about on the theory part when I said like conditions kind of
I just like don't know what that means.
Yeah, so we're actually gonna kind of discuss that then, but we can do it quickly right now. So like theory arguments are essentially reasons to reject the team outside of like what's going on in the debate. So if you think that like if the community people think that a certain counterplan is unfair, they can run a theory argument on it, which is what I did. And so that essentially says that this argument is unfair in this debate and it's a reason to reject the team.
They're accusing us of cheating.
Yes.
It's not about the content. Theory arguments are separate from the actual content of what the counterplan says it does. They're saying like the type of counterplan or like different theory arguments can come up against different affirmatives, different counterplans, etc., like different things like that. They're saying that the practice of using that specific type of argument is unfair for XYZ.
Which is, by the way, a conditions counterplan is basically we do what the app does, except we like attach strings to it. So they're just like, it's unfair that they're functionally end up with the same end result as us, except for the fact that they force negotiations in a different way. Or, like that makes it impossible to be app. Things like that.
That's kind of true.
What's going on? Oh no. Oh no, they've decided. Oh no. Alright, we're gonna take prep now.
How much prep do you get?
So it's 8 minutes for high school. Also,
Well,
yeah.
that's actually like on.
There's that right there. Ready?
Try to like mentally process like this.
Try to, you know, comprehend something in 5 minutes and they're going so fast.
Our guys right now are on the same shit, but now it's just like we're
Bro, my brain learned.
I think
I'm getting something now.
Perfect timing. Oh yeah, if you need to go to the bathroom, go now while we're prepping.
My hurt head.
My shit.
What? I get it.
Bro, I barely got stuff. Like,
That was too
no
busy trying to
cap.
understand what she was saying.
Bro, it's like I know how to do it, but not for that long.
In my debate class, we was working on it. And like during semester final semester exams, it was like he had to read like a 1MC. He had to read it fast. And if you didn't read it all in 8 minutes, then I mean you wouldn't fail. But it depends on how much you go on. You know? But I managed to do it in 8 minutes. Under actually, I did it in 45 seconds.
We were supposed to read 100 words per minute, and I could only do 50. Then I made it to 100, and my parents couldn't understand me.
She said. Yeah.
We don't get much of like Burger King.
Therefore,
So eggs.
E. That's a transition.
I know, but like. Also, like, what's it called?
And geometry.
Can somebody explain the freaking?
Also, because I'm law
If someone could just explain all the Latin words, this is like so slowly, I don't understand
law of attachment. Detachment law.
Maybe I'll slow down again in my
Weston, like Smith and Wesson.
Weston,
Like Smith and Wesson. Or Weston.
Alright, we're stopping prep. We have 5 minutes and 15 seconds remaining. And we're gonna wait for that camper to get back, so carry on.
You know how yesterday he was like unique in his leg internally?
Steal as much as you want.
No.
I'm expecting to
impact internally.
Almost like block.
I didn't hear them use anything.
Hey, you want to see the Iran?
I definitely prefer.
Yeah, what was the next thing about Iran?
Just because they produce. I'd say the only people unless
So arm sales.
but Springfield hasn't really they're traditional.
Oh, so
Iran is Shiite.
Like HFK.
Yeah.
so we gave weapons to them. Iran
Basically, yeah. Iran won't, if we give weapons to Saudi, Iran won't expand. It won't expand in the region. It's like Iran and Saudi Arabia are the two major.
That's my brother stuff, so we just started like
So what was next argument? When they were
I like the.
Iran deterrence? Yeah, like what next said yes.
The next, no, the neg was.
It's like a nice size.
The raging version is pretty nice for some weekends because you can just load it to 7 and then it's just definitely multiple uses.
Yeah. So if they close.
It's like.
That is a Vulcan rotary cannon.
I mean, U.S. economy is
Not US, the global economy.
Yeah, bitch.
How much? Name one like 10, 20. I'm gonna tell you on me.
Oil.
We got $115 on Mason.
Let me search how much of Vulcan.
Even though it's 20% of the world's oil.
Isn't it a pain in the butt to not have a mouse?
Yeah.
That's what they were on the.
Oh,
dude.
Iran also comes with 15 rebels.
Oh, you're one of those.
And Hezbollah, actually.
You're one of those. Typing in every single word in the Google search. I just look up
I know
Vulcan.
I sat down for peace talks in the past. They didn't work. But they were really
It's just they both sides kind of.
Alright, you wanna read out your notes, please?
Alright, not now.
No.
Alright.
That's fine. Answer it. How sad.
Okay, so the order is going to be the Iran deterrence disadvantage. Then the case arguments, starting with the credibility advantage. Iran deterrence, credibility, and then the Middle East case advantage page.
They're 2020.
So you don't cover everything in one rebuttal.
No. So when you are the negative, you have what's called the block, which is right after my speech is done, Biggs is going to get up and give the 1 and R. So you have, because the 2 and C and the 1 and R go right after each other, it's known as the negative block. Yes, this is the 2 and C. Because of that, if you are doing either one of these speeches, you don't want to take every single flow into all of the speeches. Most of the time, the 1 and R will take a single page in order to sort of give more time on that because there isn't cross-X after the 1 and R. So most of the time, if there's a counter plan, for instance, if there's like a sort of political counter plan or like there's like a political disadvantage for like a counter plan, the 1 and R will take that as like the net benefit most of the time. In this debate, spoilers, he's going to take the 2020 disad. A debate like this, so what I'm doing, what the 2 and C most of the time will take all of the case debate unless, and this isn't relevant until like later on, but unless you face like a really fast team that has like 3 different advantages, like maybe then the 1 and R will take like the smallest of the case pages and whatever they were doing, but that depends. But for the most part, the important thing to remember is that the 1 and R only takes 1 page and both speeches should not have every single page.
Can you give me a list of all like the Latin words that you guys say? Because I have no clue what those are.
I don't think we've said a single word of Latin so far. Okay.
Status quo means like. Status quo is like right now. English.
I mean,
one more word.
The status quo is just the current world.
But I do. I'm trying to use it too again.
Yeah, we're reviewing that later today. Don't worry.
Great.
Okay, so is everyone ready? Does anyone need the order again?
Yeah.
Okay, order one more time. The Iran deterrence disadvantage page, the credibility case page, and then the Middle East case page.
Oh,
No.
So you guys get 15 minutes straight, is that this time?
13 minutes,
13.
right?
Well, yeah.
Where's my yellow?
8 plus 5 is 13.
I'm gonna raise it.
My check.
I'm gonna raise
Yeah,
it.
and there's cross-checks after the 2 NC, but not after the 1 NR.
Ow.
She blew it.
She blew it, she used the wrong color. She was gonna be executed for this.
Okay, is everyone ready?
Parents are gonna disown you now.
Okay. The DA outweighs and turns the case. Arms sales underpin the U.S.-Saudi alliance, which is key to deter aggression from Iran from great power competitors. Ending arms sales leads towards a shutting down critical shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. Only maintaining strong sales can maintain effective deterrent postures towards challengers. That's the Hendricks 18 evidence. And blocking of key shipping lanes tanks the global economy. The importance of oil in the economy makes this effect especially acute. That's the Friedman 12 evidence. And economic decline causes nuclear war. Even the perception of future challenges can create a shift in deterrence effectiveness, making the threshold for war lower. That's Thompson. The disad outweighs on time frame. The perception of new U.S. policy that formally blocks arms sales is seen as enough of a chance for hostile actors like Iran to take aggressive action. Their argument about new arms deals being destabilizing doesn't link, since sales have already happened, which makes it non-unique. And it outweighs on magnitude. Deterrence collapse is likely to cause conflict between the U.S. and Iran in the Middle East, which draws in regional actors like Saudi Arabia, as well as great powers like China. That leads to a spill-up of conflict that goes nuclear. And it outweighs on probability. Deterrence posturing has been effective since the end of World War II. A rapid shift from that stance is likely to be seen as an opportunity for hostile action. It's better to keep the quo intact than take a risk with a shift. And yes, economic decline leads to war. Decline under Trump is particularly likely to trigger diversionary war. Their defense does not assume Trump only applies to normal, non-awful presidents. Foster 16. If the U.S. economy tanks, we expect a diversionary war. Whether presidents engage depends on psychological traits. Simplistic leaders view the world in black and white, are insensitive to risk. Distrustful leaders exaggerate threats in favor of military action when faced with a faltering economy. Leaders distrustful and simplistic are less likely to put together complex responses. They develop risky solutions that divert attention from utilizing military force. I took data on Trump into the statistical model to predict use of force. The model would predict Trump would respond in even a minor economic downturn with force. And economic development drives democracy. Risk of authoritarianism are temporary and fail. That turns the aft. Treesman 14. Economic development does lead to a great democracy. As authoritarian states become richer, they do tend to become more democratic. Under Franco, the country metaphoricized from a rural backwater to the world's 11th largest industrial economy. In periods where the leader changed, the link between income and political liberalization is strong. And since leaders always change if you wait long enough, the income-democracy relationship emerges more strongly in statistical analysis in the medium run. And yes, the Iran Strait will be closed. There's no alternative routing. Lavelle 12. Iran has the ability to block the most important oil choke point in the world. Although experts are worried about Iran's capacity to throw the global economy into chaos for decades, there's been little progress to developing alternative routes. None matches the importance of Hormuz. 20% of trade worldwide move through. Unprecedented throttling would come when the world economy is weak, and prefer the consensus of military experts. Conjunction of tactics makes closure simple. Katzman 12. In assessing Iran's capabilities, Chair Joint Chief said Iran capabilities could in fact block Hormuz. IGRC undertake operations not vetted by political leaders through purchases and tactics. Iran forces have clear asymmetric capability to use the long coast to frustrate adversaries. Mines at 5,000 different types. Detecting and clearing can be difficult and time-consuming. Small boats, small fleet, unconventional tactics, swarming, converge and attack a target in close confines. Submarines, torpedoes inflict devastating damage. Cruise missiles ready to be deployed along the coast. I'm going to skip the next two cards. And arms sales guarantee a sufficient GCC military capacity to prevent an initial Iranian attack as well as conflict escalation. Rosenfield 12. First, a major offensive weapons permit GCC states to retaliate strongly against Iran. Second, if Iran chooses to counter-retaliate, major offensive weapon will help limit the damage, convincing Iran that further escalation would not be in its interest. If the GCC states have escalation dominance
dominance over Iran should be reduce Iran's capacity to deter retaliation, thus limited freedom to commit aggression in the first place. Defensive weapons alone would not provide adequate countering to low-level aggression. Weapons allowed for retaliation against Iran minimize further escalation. And they definitely do not access the DA. The AF is a total long-term ban on arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The entire story of the DISAD is that arms sales need to happen to dissuade Iran as posturing as a strong U.S.-Saudi Arabian alliance. The AF ends the perception of this alliance, which means Iran is more likely to be regionally aggressive. And go to case, the credit advantage. Extend the Byman evidence that Trump terminally dooms democratic leadership. Even post-Trump, the U.S. is ineffective because the U.S. lacks sustainable programs, lacks anti-corruption accountability, and is impeded by partisan politics, which means that the U.S. democratic model is not exportable to other countries. Also extend that ending arms sales won't influence Saudi policies. Empirics prove Saudi is more likely to double down on its own regional goals than follow U.S. coercion to do what the U.S. wants. U.S. engagement with Egypt is an empirical example that proved that the U.S. did not get the follow-on that it wanted, like the AF is arguing for. That's the Seiko evidence. And arms sales aren't key to Saudi reform. Gauze 10. Selling or not selling the arms is not going to affect Saudi policies in democracy, women, Islam, or anything else one whit. If arms sales could destabilize the Saudi regime, that would be a reason not to do it. Many think arms sales to Iran in the 70s helped bring them down, but arms were part of the larger strategic relationships. The arms themselves did not cause the relationship or the popular reaction against it. This arms sale would not change that perception. Next, go to the Middle East, Middle East advantage page. Extend the debrief evidence that Saudi and Iran won't go to war. There's a lack of ground troops, motivation, and knowledge, and acknowledgement of mutually assured destruction prevents escalation from these two countries. That they are wrong with their characterization that it's about increased arms sales. No, it's about the actual structural setup that our evidence takes account for now. And And Iran has zero incentive to start a direct military offensive. It knows it doesn't have regional or great power support. It could never win a fight with the U.S. or allies. Bola 19. Iran possesses at best middling military power, whose conventional military forces have seriously degraded by decades of sanctions. Leader in Tehran have every incentive to avoid direct military confrontation with the U.S. The vulnerability to overwhelming American military force compelled Iranian leaders to rely on non-state proxies. While Iran can plan the anti-Western political sympathies, neither of these countries has demonstrated willingness or ability to significantly ease American economic pressures or physically oppose any military American strike on Iran. The THAAD arguments. Acquisitions of THAAD and other missile defense systems are inevitable in the region. Regional actors like UAE and Qatar are already taking steps to set up long-term access. That's Dowd 17. If we win that, it's most likely inevitable that THAAD systems will be sold by the U.S. That means their impact is inevitable, and you should vote negative, since the AF cannot change anything from the SQO. The first $1 billion payment has already been made. THAAD is a done deal. Stone 19. Lockheed Martin will receive the first payment towards the installation of a $15 billion missile defense system. The Saudis and U.S. officials signed letters of offer and acceptance, formalizing terms of the Saudis' purchase of 44 THAAD launchers, missiles, and related equipment. And even if we lose that THAAD launchers are coming now, THAAD is good. It solves prolif through providing credible deterrent to Iran. It can't be used offensively and would dissuade Iran from taking the risk on new proliferation. Razali 18. IR theory of prolif, players who respond to prolif by developing their own nuclear arsenals. The prolif theory did not predict the events correctly when the theory was conceived. There's nothing technologically equivalent to the THAAD system. The system is designed to smack down threatening ballistic missiles at altitudes as they zoom downward. THAAD is capable of intercepting and destroying short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles at 200 kilometers above the Earth. Having a THAAD system deployed may dissuade countries from rolling forward to nuclear weapons. THAAD system can dissuade rogue regimes from pursuing aggression. A recognition that the system can ease security concerns of would-be proliferators, and extend that democracy promotion fails. Nationalism, social division, corruptions are proven effects of the U.S. attempts in the Middle East. Democratic promotion is ineffective given U.S. issues. That's the Walt 16 evidence. And their step in the right direction framing is ineffective. The AF is still unclear about whose human right credibility is important. If the U.S. that's important, one, they've made the argument that the U.S. is seen as credible no matter what, which means there isn't a crisis for cred. And two, they don't cause any democratic spillover to Saudi Arabia, since they haven't explained how U.S. human right credibility is directly tradable to Saudi Arabians. They don't have evidence for that point.
Did you conduct points because you kept talking after the timer went off, or no?
Most of the time, like generally speaking, most of the time, if you're in the middle of like finishing a sentence and you go a couple seconds after, it's fine. Like it's just there's a point where if you're going more than 5 seconds, then the judge is probably going to stop flowing.
Oh yeah.
Wait, I have a question. Is it like not like standard to say like you keep your time judge at the end? Like a lot of people do that. Like
Well, yeah,
in
remember
middle.
what I said yesterday? It doesn't make sense to address the judge because that's who you should be talking to the whole time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. No, at the end. At the end. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But the debate isn't over.
Oh yeah.
I was like, keep your time.
No, yeah, I guess after the RFP.
Yeah.
Meg is saying.
This sucks.
Okay. Everybody ready? All right.
So even if Iran won't be able to close this strait, how would they be able to close it for more than a few days without like the immense amount of opposition they would be facing?
So the argument we would make is that the sort of what your card is asserting that the U.S. would just have the forces immediately available sort of is untrue. We also say that like our evidence.
To Iran, why would we not have the resources available to?
So the Katzman evidence also talks about the different sort of tactics, citing military experts that Iran would be able to do. They have different mines themselves. They use small boats for swarming tactics. Submarines and cruise missiles themselves are in the area and closer to be deployed than any U.S. forces are.
Which part is this?
That's the Katzman 12 evidence.
Katzman song. Okay. Katzman song. Okay. Yeah. So this card is from 2012, which doesn't assume like the immense amount of troops that Trump just sent to the region. So how does this like rectify it?
Troops on the ground, one, weren't directly deployed to the strait, and two, are a little bit different from actual being able to like physically hold the strait open.
They could easily be deployed if they're in the region already. They could easily be deployed in the strait if needed.
I mean, sure, that's kind of an assertion, but we have evidence that says that Iran has specific capabilities and tactics that they'd be able to use to keep the strait itself.
When was the last time it was strait?
I don't exactly know that off the top of my head, but that's sort of also the point of the disadvantage that we're saying. A lack of like ending arms sales is what Iran would see as a new opportunity to close the strait. Like they haven't done that recently because we have arms sales currently going to Saudi Arabia.
Okay. And then you assert again in the Middle East advantage that Saudi Arabia and Iran won't go to war. So the card that you're relying on here is the Omnidian 16 card. But how are these, like, how does this assume the current 2019 tensions where the U.S. is already escalating tensions in Iran and things like that? And
I didn't read the Omidi card, but I read the Bolin card under it.
Sorry.
That card talks about the sort of military capability. I'm sorry, you said why does that assume tensions?
Well, okay, so it's talking about the military capability. It's saying that neither of these countries have the capability to do so, but that's the point of the affirmative is that Saudi Arabia would have the military capabilities to do so absent the affirmatives. So, like, this doesn't assume arms sales, essentially, is what it's saying.
I think this card definitely does assume arms sales, given that it is a recently cut evidence in the fact of that. It also talks about how Iran, it talks about how Iran does not see American capabilities as like a willingness to stop their aggression.
No.
Oh wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
It was in like the last rebuttal. So does a non-unique argument mean that it's not gonna happen?
Kinda. It means that it is either like kind of already happening to some extent. So like, what argument?
I don't know. He said something like, wait, red is neg. Okay, yeah. So he said like something outweighs on time and sales have already happened, so it's non-unique.
Yeah. So those sales, like we're talking about, our app is all predicated off of like sales to Saudi Arabia, but some of those sales have already happened. And so the impact to those sales is non-unique because we should have seen like these global wars and things like that.
that makes sense.
Think about like if their argument is if there are arms sales, something bad would happen. An argument that something is non-unique is saying those are happening already. That's the threshold which you said bad things were happening. So why haven't we seen those bad things happen?
Okay.
Right. So the order of my speech is going to be the counter plan, and then the 2020 disadvantage.
That's it.
That is it.
Wait, yeah.
Do they have to do theirs or no?
Yeah, there's 2 more with 5 minutes.
There's 3 more. 5. 3 more.
Because that was oh, next that was in a row, right?
Yeah, it's a negative
Alright.
block.
So, and this speech is only 5 minutes, and there's no more crowd services. All right. So is everybody ready to go?
No.
I'll give you a minute. So it's just a conditions counter plan, and then the 2020 consent. Yes.
Are they offering? Wait, who's speaking?
Negative speech. The negative is speaking. So yes. So yeah, we have our final constructive, and then we also get our first rebuttal right now. Okay. You do not look ready to flow.
I am as ready as I'll ever be.
All right. So if everybody is good, we're going to start. On the conditions counterplan, we're going to concede the permutation is a test of competition. Conditions counterplans are good. It's key to NetFlex to be able to test the method of the app. Yes, we're a stable advocacy. Our plan text has not shifted throughout the round, and we are predictable. We're the core of the topic counterplan. It's also not a delay CP. The CP does not necessarily result in the same action as the app. An error neg on an already app-leaning topic, and it's a reason to reject the argument, not the team, not going for it solves our offense. On to the 2020 disadvantage.
What?
The disad outweighs, I'll go over it in a minute. The disad outweighs in terms of case. Key framing issues. They have 100% conceded the internal link between the Paris deal and extinction level warming, which makes it try or die for the negative. Plan causes runaway global warming, which spurs immediate devastation and undercuts every impact. Ocean acidification immediately undermines the food chain and causes mass starvation, leads to mass resource shortages that precipitate starvation, undermines state legitimacy, which independently triggers conflict. Laundry list of scenarios all trigger extinction. Their evidence is from some random contributor, obviously prefers scientific consensus. It also doesn't take into account conflict that is exacerbated and resource shortages that that magnify global warming, and it also independently triggers food shortages, which independently causes nuclear war, FDI 12. Food insecurity can result in war. Researchers point to Germany's World War II efforts. If large reasons run short of food, wars follow. An increasingly credible scenario for World War III is a festering chain of resource conflicts. The UK, CIA, and Oslo Institute identify famine as a potential trigger for nuclear war. Conflict across boundaries could be caused by disputes over shared resources, and our impact turns human rights. It leads to increased competition, which crowds out poor and minority communities and exacerbates atrocities. It also turns Saudi. It exacerbates tensions in the region, which causes conflict over resources. The DA also solves the act because the Dems winning in 2020 means they pass arms reduction sales anyways. And on the uniqueness level, Dems are winning in the status quo, but it's not locked in. Trump has struggled to broaden his appeal and has led to a unified and energized Democratic front in the quo, but inconsistent messaging can still shatter coalitions. That's the Rothenberg evidence. Their uniqueness evidence focuses too broadly on precedent from past elections, but does not look to the unique standing of Trump. Of the Trump presidency, which has been a dividing point in U.S. society. Yes, in the past, incumbents have generally won, but those presidents are also not Trump. And also, like, Bush lost his re-election back in, like, 94 or 92 or whatever. And Trump's election has uniquely rallied a Democratic base against his presidency, but a major policy flip towards a more liberal policy saps momentum from Dems campaigning. The other warrant is just about the economy, but they have conceded that foreign policy is uniquely key to the election and outweighs other causes. That's also in their own Demedgerin evidence. And Trump is trailing in independent voters too, Blake 6-6. Warning signs in Michigan, more than 51% say they plan to vote for someone else. Polls show Trump floundering among independents. In Texas, independents disapproved of Trump by 21 points, and Trump is trailing in key swing states, so is a 6-11. Michigan and Pennsylvania, midterm suggests a snapping back to Democrats. The tide is turned against Trump in Michigan and Pennsylvania, 54% disapprove. Down on their too early to tell argument. This argument only flows neg. If it is true that uniqueness is bound to shift, then the only thing that is certain is the direction of the link where we are 100% controlling this debate. The only thing we know is that if the affirmative locks in a Trump 2020 win, which should be sufficient to trigger a neg ballot and our impact scenario, and on the thumper level, all of their thumpers are solely in the context of Iowa and is not representative of the general public. Their evidence on this is really bad. Only R speaks to the overall strategy of the Democrats' campaign, which uniquely affects national voter and outreach, and foreign policy outweighs all of their thumpers. Smells 626.
With so much consensus, presidential aspirants have struggled to distinguish themselves on foreign policy. The U.S. electorate has grown committed to these principles, while the president has moved in the opposite direction. 57% of respondents said they disapprove of his foreign policy. This time, foreign policy might tip the election. And on the link, the app eliminates a key campaign talking point that if we're Democrats, enhance the election to Trump. Frontrunners like Biden and Bernie have all hedged public statements on Trump's dealings with Saudi Arabia. That's the Rios evidence. And the Dems are using Trump's pro-Saudi stance as a foil in their campaign. The app reverses that. The current evidence that they read is literally our argument. The link is better than the link term. Our evidence specifically speaks how the election is a referendum on Trump, and the perception of him passing a more liberal foreign policy plan collapses Democratic enthusiasm and splits the independent vote. Their evidence is literally supportive of our argument. It just says that Saudi is a key rebuke from Dems, which makes it a perfect campaign talking point to rally support. Once Trump passes a liberal policy like this, that eliminates that key talking point, which Dems are hedging their bets on. And if they win that, it passes by overriding a veto. This still dooms Dems because Republicans would get credit for standing up to Trump because they have a majority in the Senate, which also hurts enthusiasm, particularly swing voters who are worried about Trump's temperament but overall support policy positions may feel like Congress can rein him in on his worst impulses and may be inclined to vote for him anyways.
Can you re-say the conditions counterplan?
Yeah, so what I said on that, so basically we're not going for that argument is what happened. So we decided, okay, the block happened, we should narrow down our off-case positions, we're not going for it. So the only thing I did was I conceded, the permutation, just showing that the counterplan isn't competitive. They'll go more into that in like your lab. But then I had to answer the theoretical argument for why the counterplan was bad, because like we said earlier, that's like entirely independent from the rest of the debate. So that's just saying if they cheated, they should lose for it. And we're saying, no, we didn't cheat. It was fair for us to read this counterplan, and I listed several reasons why, basically. Yeah.
So you can still win if you just completely don't talk about it the rest of the debate, or is that bad?
Yeah. So the reason the negative team reads like a lot of different off-case positions in the 1 and C is so that you can test the affirmative in multiple ways. So you want to narrow those arguments down by the final speech to like one specific argument, maybe two if it's a counter plan. But you do that so so you test the affirmative in multiple different vantage points, see which one they don't answer well, then you can just go for that in the 2 and R. But you're only going to be able to really explain one position really well by the end of the debate. So you're going to want to narrow it down. Other thoughts? They're just doing prep for the 1AR, so it's going to be the first affirmative. Yeah.
So if you didn't answer, they're like things on counter plan. Can they use it against you later?
Not in this. Technically, they would be allowed to if it applied to a different flow. But they can't be they conceded a solvency deficit on the counter plan, so they should lose. No, we kicked the position. It wouldn't make sense.
Talking fast isn't illegal, right?
What?
Talking fast isn't illegal, right?
You don't have to talk fast, no.
But you gotta we gotta make sure you read your pitch.
So yeah, once you get in higher level debates, they tend to generally speak a lot faster because they want to fit in as many arguments as possible. And obviously talking fast.
So is it better to have one really well thought out example, or 10 or 20 examples that you don't really elaborate on, but you just bring up?
So I guess I'm confused. It depends on what the context is. Maybe I'm kind of confused on the question. Could you elaborate a little bit more?
On the thing that, what if you're doing it right now? If you just kept talking about one thing and elaborated on it really well and explained it really well, instead of talking about 10 or 20 little things.
So are you talking about one flow or sheet of paper?
I think this is quality over quantity, which one's better.
Yeah, you should definitely. So when you narrow it, yeah.
Generally, as the debate goes on, you shift more in the rebuttals. You kind of narrow down the arguments so that you can go into more depth and quantity of those arguments. That's why the negative in this debate kicks the counterplan, so they didn't have to keep talking about it. They could talk about other things in more detail if they wanted.
Yeah, and then you can add specific examples within if I were to talk about
how warming exacerbates, I don't know, let's just say resource shortages. I can just name, a specific basin somewhere dried up and crops are destroyed in a specific region. Like I could pull examples like that, but generally want to narrow down like the scope of arguments. Good questions, Phil.
3. One judge.
You didn't know there was a tournament, so there was 7 calls. So this is like one judge. Can I get a win for middle school, but for some reason he likes kids for middle school? Hold up, y'all just explain that to me.
Okay, that is
Some weapon.
Yeah, I get that, but tell me the argument.
so
basically they sold 44 bad. THAA.
So it's a missile defense thing.
Yeah.
So that they basically.
But isn't that not?
I think it's like a
it's we sell to.
But it's a defense system, it's not arms.
The house is on missile
Because
systems.
but it's a defense system. Doesn't an arms system have to be offensive?
No, they can be training.
Okay, so
Military
goods or services.
Arms are defined as military goods or services. There's nothing in it about saying offensive.
Somebody should find that. That's a good. Okay. So wait. So.
You already said that in the first lecture. Remember?
So what they're saying
What's
is.
the affirmative saying about that? And
What the affirmative is saying about
Just an
that
example, dude.
is that it's not actually a deterrent to Iran because basically Iran has no incentive to launch missiles whatsoever because they're all going to get shot down. And it minimizes the damage to Saudi Arabia.
Okay. So affirmative wants to reduce arms systems. So they want to reduce the amount of defense systems.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But those so why is reducing the amount of defense systems that they're good?
Because that is the most, what's it called? It's the most,
No. The affirmative said.
It's the most modern
The
weapon
affirmative
system out
wrote
there.
that first, and then I was like, I don't know what's going on, so I kept
What are the
shiny salamander.
What are the affirmative saying?
The affirmative
It's
The shiny salamander.
So it's one of the most, what's it called? It's one of the most.
Saudi Arabia retains some bad batteries.
It's one of the most.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia retains
Wait,
bad
bruh,
batteries.
that guy's
That's what
addicted.
it's saying. They're saying that they retain it.
They're keeping the.
They're keeping the bad batteries.
That means if they use another THAAD, you can use it.
So they're just like hoarding fat batteries.
Well, they don't need to buy more THAAD batteries.
And so the affirmative.
They don't need any more.
To reduce. Okay.
The affirmative
We don't need
saying
to buy
we
more
reduce
bad
sales, the
batteries.
negative wants to say we need to not, we don't want to substantially.
So they have too many bad systems. Anyway, so then the negative response said that like bad systems are inevitable.
Bad systems are great, the negative bad systems.
It's already been
tried. It prevents
tried.
Iran, it prevents
Yeah,
Iran from
that's
launching a
amazing.
missile because first of all, the attack will most likely be blunted, and then there be severe retaliation. Basically, they said that Iran has no incentive to attack because
Never
basically,
it's been told and you can't do anything about it now because they're
it's basically like basically like doing something and then having it completely blown up and still being retaliated. There's no physical point in why you would do that. The entire thing is supposed to work. It's not good if it doesn't work and then you get destroyed.
Why are they hurting bad batteries?
Because why not?
Very good.
Like they don't have to buy bad batteries anymore. They already have them.
Fads are less effective than Patriots.
Bad batteries are just that's why they're so expensive.
Especially the Patriots.
They're completely ineffective, but still.
Patriots don't get distracted.
Can that be used offensively?
No.
Effectively, so it's just
Effectively,
why
no.
is the affirmative effectively?
Yeah. Effectively, like
I know. So then they can't technically pro. So how does that make
effective?
Hold on.
Yeah, so actually it's pretty effective. Oh, true.
Yeah, but defensively it's terrible.
The order is case, in the order of credibility, then stability, then the 2020, and then deterrence.
What was it again?
Case in the order of credibility, then Middle East stability, and then 2020, then deterrence.
Have you ever heard of SDI? SDI. Strategic Defense Initiative.
Tell me later.
Commonly nicknamed Star Wars.
Wait,
So it was a thing created by Ronald Reagan. So basically, like a laser shield against the
Head up the.
People want to know against maybe.
It was it, isn't it? FTO. I want to play.
Trump started galactic.
where's Best Buy? Yeah, so I think exactly. I'm not bringing it up.
Actually, no. It's pretty effective. So imagine, okay, so imagine a ballistic missile takes about 14 minutes.
Alright, everyone, hey,
Hey, Jen.
y'all good? You know where you're starting? Credibility page.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The Saudi track record on human rights is egregious and worsening. Activists and reporters have been tortured, abused, and killed. Holding Saudi to account is not only an ethical imperative, but key to U.S. security. Current legislation is insufficient, and the cool parent argument that we should give them our weapons because we get a greater say over how they're deployed has proven routinely untrue in Yemen, as today's drone strikes on the innocents are brought to you by the good people at Raytheon. The FAA is a good starting point, but the BDHRL is unequipped to enforce the Leahy provisions, meaning that absent the act, there isn't a functional check on foreign military sales. Saudi abuses are legitimized by U.S. support, and our influence is essential to confront Riyadh's abuses. It's up to the U.S. to use its influence to control Saudi Arabia. Their Buyman card isn't responsive to the internal link to the credit advantage. It doesn't say anything about Trump decking human rights leadership. The U.S. is still key, despite things like Guantanamo Bay. Individual instances doesn't change the fact that the U.S. has consistently led the way for decades on human rights around the world. We can look at international agreements and the foundation of international organizations and multilateral partnerships. The U.S. consistently partners with other nations to improve human rights across the globe, which is recognized by international governments. And their Witten card is wrong. If it were true, we would have seen Saudi Arabia pulling out of Yemen. That hasn't happened, so it's try or die for the AF. Also, arms sales are a bargaining chip to force Saudi reforms on human rights. They can't turn to the Russians or the Chinese. They're too invested. F-16s don't come in Russian, and U.S. technology powers signal intelligence systems, which enable U.S. U.S. and Saudi military capabilities. They are predicated on U.S. intelligence. The signal is incredible to U.S. officials because we'll just turn off the spigot, even in the best case scenario. And on Middle East stability, we don't need to win the Iran close the strait to win this debate. And that doesn't matter. Even if they signed a contract, the plan rolls it back because the international agreements can't be signed and authenticated by the Congress of the President without consent. And the AF kills that. And 2020, we didn't concede the internal link. That's silly. They conceded that incumbency is the single largest consideration for chances of winning re-election. The next academic models are better than phone polling. 12 out of 12 studies go our way. Dems are losing now. Don't trust their evidence. It's predicated on phone polls, which our author says are pointless this early and always biased towards people who are politically active and not swing voters. Also, Michigan and Pennsylvania aren't sufficient to ensure a Dem win. Their evidence doesn't say that. And Dem debates and the last Dem debates the other day spend literally 2 minutes on foreign policy and all of it on China. Saudi Arabia and arms sales are not a 2020 issue. Insert this tweet here. I'm not going to read it. On the link turn, it's a double bind. Either Dems get credit for the referendum on Trump or they lose anyways because Dems are already campaigning on Saudi Arabia. It'll happen anyways. It's either inevitable or the plan makes it not inevitable. And no warming. Adaptation and resilience soft warming. No impact because the IPCC is alarmist and don't even consider the potential for adaptation. Physical impacts are over the top and species are already starting to adapt. Extinction claims are based on speculation. That's hard 2015. The IPCC are wildly alarmist. Each scenario is without any reference to technological achievement or adaptation. Why should the rest of humanity not be able to do likewise? Over the course of more than a century, only negative impacts ignore the reality of adaptation. There is no basis for the claim about severe weather-related threats or malnutrition. Species loss is slowly reaching its lowest level in 500 years. Species have been shown to have the ability to adapt rapidly to changes in the climate, and there's no risk of a turn here. All their evidence indicates we already passed the peak. Impacts should be occurring now. Now, it's way too... and there's no... it's way too early to predict the debate. The Rakic evidence explains that polls fail and anything can happen between now and 2020. An example of the 2008 financial crisis, which drastically changed the course of the election. The uniqueness should determine the direction of the links because they were so light on this in the last speech. If we win, you can't predict the election, then there's no reason to believe the app will lock in a 2020 win when literally a million possibilities could happen. Second, we lack the ability to determine when the necessary variables for accurate predictions. That's Rakic in 19 House states will lean relative to the nation will determine the next party has the electoral college advantage. The strength of the ultimate Dem nominee will determine those how those leans. But they're exactly the kind of thing that we lack in precision to predict this far in advance. And you should prefer our uniqueness evidence. Theirs relies on polls. They're flawed. And 12 out of the 12 models predict Trump as a winner because of the economy as well as incumbency. It's too early to predict. Okay. And on deterrence. Next sheet. U.S.-Saudi relations are resilient. What? Okay. They need us more than we need them. In a region of unsteady alliances, the U.S. offers a consistent partner on counterterrorism and a check in Iran. That means that they won't go rogue. And there's no closure. International patrol solves Marx and 15. Shipping corridors used by the Gulf exporters are not at risk from volatility in Yemen. And the seizure of IS is a robust international presence. The Marx. Yeah, it's at the bottom.
Was that negative?
No.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Two more cookies.
She said it's too much juice left.
Wait, he said it's not confirmed in 2 states.
So sad.
What is it?
That Trump is going to lose.
Bro, if he wins, drop me off at Canada, bro.
Bruh.
If Trump wins, stop Earth and let me off on like Mars or something.
Wait, Trump isn't a bad. Wait, Trump isn't a bad president.
Oh,
He's
Really?
Yeah.
I'm not.
Like,
You don't know that.
No, what is it?
Yeah.
It's
I'm moving to Canada, bro.
it takes a bunch of polls, evaluates them,
Yeah, how do you know
and
who's
weights them.
predicted to lose? There's not even a nominee.
I know, but there's already polls.
Yeah,
Right.
But who do they poll? Like, I've never been, like, my parents never been.
Maryland University.
Like, but like what?
They only use like 500 respondents.
Exactly, like, it's like so stupid.
He does stupid things.
Like, because if you take 500 people in a certain area, it's not.
It
gonna
depends.
work.
They do the entire state. They do everything.
If someone else that's stupid is running,
Based on
it's
the
like
tweets, Iowa. If we're gonna win the Iowa caucus.
He's 100%.
No. He has like the most campaign funding.
His
Like,
tweets are so dumb though.
Biden is gonna win the Iowa caucus.
He has everybody else, so I don't have money.
Who?
Yeah. Trump has more campaigning like money than like all of the Democratic nominees combined. You see, like,
Do you know why? I'm gonna tell you why. I'm gonna tell you why he has
why?
He turned re-election 3 days after his inauguration.
Oh, yeah, I understand that, but like, so did the Democrats.
No.
They had their eyes on this. Yeah,
They don't.
Trump.
They did no, but here's the problem. Here's the problem. Trump started his election in like 2017. What happened before 2020 and in between 2017?
The primary.
And no, what happened before the primaries and in between 2017? The midterm elections.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is what all the Democrats in 2017 are funding, working on, where they were focused on taking back the House. the Senate.
Which we didn't.
Which is why, which is why 900.
But I would also
Which
say
is
he
why,
has more funding
which is why
because he
99%
doesn't
of the
have.
mom needs right now are after the movement, which were in December and after the 2018. Everything was focused on the 2018 before.
No, but also he as a Republican nominee doesn't have as much competition. Like who even are the Republican nominees? Like
Bill Wells,
It-
former governor of Massachusetts, libertarian candidate.
I don't know why anybody's trying to the Republican Party. Like,
Which is why nobody is
He's
trying.
obviously
So
not gonna get
obviously
reelected. Nobody's
He's
expecting
100%
him to.
not gonna get reelected.
I wanna bet on this election.
He was 100% not gonna get elected in the first place.
Never underestimate the amount of American idiocy. Never underestimate.
Trump is better than Clinton though.
Yeah, I really think people want to sit there now for hesitant.
Dude, nobody. Just to read his tweets. I'll do it for the tweets.
It ain't even about the tweets, bro. It ain't even about
I'm gonna look at this
that.
tweet
I'm
right
gonna
now.
vote for the tweets.
It's not even about
Because you already
that.
know his tweets are gonna be
Okay.
stupid for the next 4 years.
He gonna keep tweeting even if
He doesn't believe
Most
it.
people are aware, according to the polls, I won every debate. Basically, was
Climate change is
yeah,
bad.
actually, you lost every debate. I remember there's that line in one of the debates where you're like, we are a third world country.
Bro, it made me so
We're a
mad.
third world country.
When I
People
got
like
off,
you don't pay
when I got off the
taxes.
plane, when I first went, I got off the airport, right? I was walking, going to baggage claim. I saw a Make America Great Again hat. I almost slapped it off the rack.
I mean, they have the right to wear that.
Oh no,
Yeah.
they're right to wear hats.
Fake
Not
news.
stupid ones.
No, you're allowed to wear stupid hats. You can't assault someone who wears stupid hats.
No, it was on the rack, right? And I was walking, I was like, I seen it, but I was ready.
Baby Trump.
I'm hoping someone
Baby Trump is grounded.
more to the right on gun control.
That's sad.
Because he hasn't really done against
I got a 6 case.
My favorite Democratic nominee is not gonna win.
Who is it?
I love Andrew Yang.
Idiot.
I love him. Why do you say?
That's an audible.
Positions on conservative. His conservative
What?
positions
You wanna
are
trade?
looking at the Democratic Party and saying, this is what it is. This one? Nope,
He's like
nope,
the
nope.
most.
Comes with an audible.
Would you say he's like
Comes with a.
left or right of the America?
Moderate right.
Yeah, I would say moderate right too, and I think that's smart.
I know, I think I'm pointing to, I think people research Mayor South Bend, Indiana, small transgender people.
Bro, if he don't win, he's gonna be heated. He's gonna tweet out
Perfect.
like
He's gonna get mad.
freaking 8
I think Kamala Harris is gonna get it. I think Kamala Harris is gonna get it.
Yes.
Why would you survive?
11% of people said they would never vote for a gay person.
Yeah. And why would you survive?
Because Joe Biden's old, a white male, and people in the Democratic
He
Party.
has 33% and Kamala has like 12. Like,
Wow.
Yeah, except Kamala's winning in California.
This is the last speech, so.
Biden,
Last two.
We still waiting on someone.
Buttigieg is winning in Virginia Beach.
Yeah, is anybody in the bathroom? Y'all know. Yeah. Is there someone in the bathroom?
Biden is
Someone sitting over there.
And Fidel Castro, who's like taking from
Castro. Can you say Fidel Castro?
You know he was the dictator.
Fidel Castro was the governor.
No,
Was a dictator of Cuba.
no.
Julian Castro.
Messed up there.
Whisper in your ear.
Fidel Castro's dead.
I know. Sorry, messed up. Brain fart. But like he's gained like so much support. No, yeah, but I'm just saying like Biden is not automatic.
He's from Delaware. That's all we have.
Here's what
all we have.
Here's who I think is gonna win. Here's who I think will take us next week. Kamala Harris, and then it's gonna be somebody like
Everybody just like
really roasted Biden. Roasted Biden. Like you have post bus like it was in the school girl with the second buses. I was at school girl.
This is
He's about to get roasted.
Welcome to President of 2048.
Bill Nye.
The final
Actually,
you're done.
Bill Nye was being
This is it.
I was vote for Bill Nye.
Either he's gonna win us the debate or not.
Y'all vote for me for President of 2048.
He reformed Congress.
Those things are a great way to get children to school.
Bill Nye is
Donald
just
Trump.
Bill Nye's not gonna
graduate from Cornell.
He's
a TV
He's
show.
an actual PhD. He's a
I
PhD.
understand, but he's very like public figure. He's not in that way.
What is wrong with you?
You talk about basic like surface level topics for the public.
No. Do you know why?
That's
No, it's actually not.
Did you watch the documentary that he made about climate change?
Like,
That makes
No, you don't have the reason why. You say that, no, you're saying that because you don't know that he actually is extremely outspoken when it comes to, you know how many, okay, I'll just say
Bill Nye's
he's
an
extremely
actual
outspoken, you just know,
scientist.
you just think that because you know he's watching all the science stuff, we all hate him, everybody. Bill Nye
We
knows
all
about
hate
all
him.
that stuff.
This is outrageous.
Yes. But here's the thing, you never.
Sorry, Haley?
Bill Nye's extremely outspoken.
He's a PhD scientist.
You know, if I just search.
Yeah, I guess, like-
Technically prep ended, but we're just, it's a done. Yeah.
We're just
Until whoever's in the back
extremely
comes back.
outspoken when it comes to climate change.
And he changed. And you're like, oh, you must be the real scientist.
I would like to announce now.
Oh, you're what happened?
He's not going to base.
I wish there was a replay button on the
He's
not a real scientist.
Shut up.
You too, stop it.
If you say Bill Nye in your next debate, I'll destroy you.
What's wrong with citing Bill Nye?
Okay, you can do that. You can do that. But I'm talking about a better papers.
Like, Bill like graduated from Cornell though.
Okay, congratulations.
He's a genius.
I would like to announce now that I'm running for 2048 president.
2048.
Yeah, 2048.
Oh, yeah, there's like 2 more.
You gotta go like 35, right? Yeah.
2 more.
That will be
Final next speech.
44 and 2048. So.
Who wants to listen to the voice?
Aren't we missing somebody in the background?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so.
Who's the other?
She's been out for a while.
Oh, the one who was
Other person who
murderer.
switched names.
Yeah, that murderer.
So, yeah, I think.
Oh yeah, I mixed between she and Deja.
The squad.
That was like horrible and surprising at the same time.
I would name that child that. It's like ultimate embarrassment for like their whole life.
Bad.
You can't like grant your name, you can't name your child.
I just hear what the fuck.
Yeah, I love
Nowadays, I think people just be naming that child. Like, they give them like honey blessing earth.
Oh,
something like that. I'm like,
My parents did that for me in the Indian language. They named me Love. That's what my name is.
My name is
God of the earth.
bro, I know a female. Her name is so long, bro. I swear, I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't pronounce her
Why would
last
I
name.
touch them?
That's
I
it.
didn't touch them.
yeah, why would he do
My
that?
roommate's name is literally just intelligent in her language. It just means intelligent.
Look,
So,
her
like,
name
you
is
walk around
her name is
Ew.
Amala Chukwu Faith Blessing Okaname.
No need. This is my
Yeah, I'm still
my
living.
last name. Mahajan.
Can I put numbers in my kid's name? That'd be so funny.
I'm gonna name my child 1, 2, 3. But it's gonna be like spelled different. It's gonna be 1, and then I don't know how to spell 2 and 3. It's gonna spell like.
Like Larry doesn't mean anything.
Well, most Christian names are just like things people from the Bible.
Yeah, Genesis, stuff like that. I know. I can name you about 20. Well, of course,
I know so
point you
many.
out. I can point you out about 20 people that I know that's named Genesis.
Which
I don't know anything about the Bible. Actually,
I will accept
I
that.
know Judas.
I will accept that.
He's a traitor. Yeah.
Who's Adam? Who's Adam?
He's not Adam.
00139.
Judas betrayed.
0010139.
0010139. Gotta make jingle.
Wait, so where did she check?
That's what I'm saying. That bad.
3109.
Larry the Cable Guy.
All right.
You may come in.
Wait, are we still
No, they're almost done.
I think this was 6 lunch. Yeah, we're gonna break. We're gonna go over it in a minute.
Lunch is still gonna be at 12:30.
Yeah, lunch is the same time. We're just doing
Roblox is lit.
No, everybody wins.
Talk to us after this.
Wait, when does the vote start?
As soon as everybody's quiet.
Literally right now.
All right.
All right.
2020.
So the order is going to be the 2020 disad, then the deterrence disad, and then the case pages in the order of credibility and Middle East.
And this is the second to last one?
Yes,
right.
yes. This is
I'm
the
gonna need
final.
you to say that one more
final
time.
non-vote. All right. Order one more time.
2020. And what else?
2020 disad, deterrence disad,
Okay, that's all I need.
cred advantage page, Middle East advantage page.
That's cool. After this, we're gonna go over this, and then after that, we'll have lunch. Yeah.
Okay. Everyone good? All right. On 2020, we're going to concede there's no impact of global warming. Takes out any potential offense from the link turn. So we're done with that. Deterrence is set. They've conceded Iran can close the strait. That causes economic decline as oil exports are completely cut off. They've conceded that economic decline both collapses deterrence and guts any international cooperation on issues. All we need to win is a risk that ending arms sales creates an opportunity that Iran sees as an attempt to be aggressive. Out of the 1AR, they have no direct defense or answer on the impact level of this disad. So that means you should not weigh any new arguments in the 2AR. Yes, Iran can close the strait. 2 warrants. 1, there's no alternative routing to geographic challenges. The strait is the only path into the region, a key lifeline of the oil trade. That's the Lavelle evidence. And 2, Iran has the military capability to close and hold the strait. Our evidence cites multiple military experts, which is a qualification greater than their rando website contributor. Iran can use multiple methods: mines, small boats, submarines, and cruise missiles that are all closer deployed and ready than U.S. forces. Even a small disruption triggers economic ripples that set off Trump when decline hits, because only even a small economic decline triggers Trump reactionary lash out. That is a conceded warrant from our econ impact evidence. The only defense they read in the 1AR is this Marex evidence, which says that international patrols solved, but doesn't say even what organization this international patrols are, and it's from 2015, which definitely means they're not deployed there now. You definitely prefer our evidence, which says that the Iranian military is much more capable than unnamed deploy. Unnamed patrol. They've also conceded the Rosenfeld evidence that arms sales guarantee a sufficient military capacity to prevent an Iranian attack as well as conflict escalation. The Rosenfeld evidence is very good because it talks about how states in this area having U.S. arms sales are able to push back against Iran because it cuts back against their ability to counter retaliate, as well as having a greater strength over Iran, which stops Iranian aggression in the first place, because Iran thinks they cannot defeat the armed states in the region that are armed by the U.S. The disad outweighs on time frame because that new perception is seen as enough a chance. It only takes a small amount of time. It definitely outweighs on magnitude because deterrence collapse is likely to create conflict between the U.S. and Iran in the Middle East, which draws in those regional actors. That is a greater scenario than their only scenario they have at this point, which is the human rights abuses. So it's more likely that a breakdown from a lack of deterrence is more likely to bring in more regional actors. And create a better case. The credit advantage suffers from a double bind. Either U.S. credit is so strong and so good that there isn't anything the plan actually does to improve it, which means their scenario is wrong about the effect it has on Saudi Arabia, or U.S. credit is important, but arms sales aren't important enough to affect that by itself. They've conceded the Basakio evidence that ending arms sales doesn't influence Saudi policies. The empirics prove that Saudi Arabia is more likely to double down on its own policy goals rather than follow U.S. coercion on what the U.S. wants. The U.S. engagement in Egypt proves this especially because that is a specific example in the region, and both to what the sort of goal of the affirmative is that completely failed. And they also concede the Goss evidence that arms sales are not key to Saudi reform. Their evidence, the examples their evidence cites conflate the importance of the arms themselves. At best, they contribute to the strategic relationship that the U.S. had, but the trade of the arms themselves is not enough to change that. They also say, That's pretty much fine. The examples they give about about the U.S. legitimizing these sort of abuses that Saudi Arabia does are not only linked to the arms sales themselves. And also, again, because they've said that the U.S. human rights credibility is so high, it doesn't really matter even if that the legitimization of Saudi Arabia is seen as negative on the U.S. because according to their own arguments, the U.S. always looks super dope. The Middle East advantage. We're only going for one argument on this page, that THAAD systems are inevitable. Local regional actors like UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia are purchasing THAAD systems for long-term use. The spending deals are locked in with billions already spent. It means the AF can't change both the systems already sold, if they are in fact destabilizing, as well as that other countries with those systems would make their impact inevitable. That's the Dowd and Stone evidence. Their evidence talks about how any sales from the U.S. are destabilizing to Iran. If that is true, then their impact is already inevitable because there are multiple other countries near Iran that already have those. They've also conceded basically a turn to THAAD themselves, that the plan rolling back arms sales is uniquely bad because it triggers a new link to the deterrence to THAAD. It's not a question of whether or not THAAD sales continue around the plan post-AF, but whether or not THAAD are good for regional stability, which we are crushing them on. They are good. They solve prolif through providing a credible deterrent to Iran. The Rezi evidence states that Iran doesn't have the modern tech to beat the missile deployment strategies they have, which makes it less likely to attempt new prolif. We're also ahead on the question of THAAD use. They can't be used offensively because it's just a high altitude missile defense system, not a weapon itself, which means that it's not perceived as aggressive. It just means they can't beat it.
Okay,
I'm messing with it.
That cannot be used offensively. Again, it's like yeah. Again, it's like what's another
What?
It's like no, it's like
No, I'm about to say.
Patriot. Using a shield offensively, it doesn't really. It's not as effective. Yes, it's only the shield's only used defensively. You can't really do that much damage with the shield. You go like this.
AMDs can.
Captain America, very nice.
Most AMDs double as AA.
Okay, but here's the problem. Yes, and what's Captain America's shield? Captain America's shield, which is physically does not obey the laws of physics.
Most AMDs double as
I'm just saying, and shield can be used.
If you want to take the laws of physics,
You're not 5'6".
5'6". I want to adopt it
There's a
today.
lot of physics that is true.
everybody. I sort of just reject the laws of physics.
I'm 5'1". I go into a debate. Physics are real.
Stand up.
If you said that, I would throw you like somewhere. Laws of physics are not. It's just the laws of physics are not real.
Wait, do you guys take this?
I'm not
growing anymore either. Why?
Oh, word. I'm not done growing.
What do you mean why? After a certain point in your life, you stop growing.
I'm not done growing.
Dude, I'm 16.
What? Wait, she's 16? What?
Yes, how old do you think I was?
Like,
Well,
honestly, I thought it was a solid 13. I'm gonna give you that.
Give you 13
I
give you 13 to be generous.
Yeah.
I mean, I give you 13 to be generous. I thought you were in like.
I'm sure, yes, I look young.
Front page on the unicycle.
Looking young, like, honestly, it benefits you when you're, like, above 25.
Yeah, wait till you're 20.
Everybody thinks I look like 23. I'm like, nah, fam. Like, bro.
But the thing is like, you can pull off.
I tell movie theaters I'm 12 and under.
Bro, I was at work last week and somebody asked me what it was. People think I'm like,
where do you work?
16. It's not a out of state place. It's only in Arkansas.
Oh.
There's really like 2 restaurants. Okay. There's one in one part and then one in the other part.
Oregon is Arkansas, like.
No, isn't there
It's next to Texas. I can tell you that.
Is it close to New Orleans?
Yeah.
It's a good chicken.
Definitely.
I'm not buying one. I'm not buying one today.
Why?
I
am.
You're gonna need something.
My stomach is like on tire flat right now.
That is why it's so small. You don't eat. You can't eat a whole bunch. You gotta eat some food.
I can't eat a whole bowl of Chipotle. That's why
My stomach feels like SpongeBob knows in that one episode. Just went flat. Or like an empty balloon, like when you let out air up.
That's what your stomach feels like?
Yeah.
I feel like that constantly. If I don't eat, I feel weird.
But it's like if I eat something, then I'm straight for the rest of the day. Until like the middle of the night, I just like wake up like, dang, I'm hungry. But everything can be closed. I'm like, man.
I can never tell if I'm hungry. If I'm hungry, I just get really mad.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just got mad at me for saying Bill Nye, so I guess you're hungry. My robot.
Bill
A suitcase of snacks?
See, her mom's a real one.
What did you get? Did you bring a suitcase of snacks?
I did not. And then, you know what? I did. Bought me some fruit snacks. That's, yeah.
That's all you need?
Yeah, for real. I had to pay $30 for my suitcase. I'm like, bruh. I got to the airport. I thought it was gonna be free, but only the carry-ons was out to pay $30. I'm like, bruh.
You didn't even have an adblock.
Yeah, but debate coach.
You don't have a debate coach? Yeah, cause I don't trust a lot of like stuff. I'm like,
oh yeah, Washington Post, they fact checked the statement that Trump said for Bruce were snapped in my eye.
what?
They fact checked it.
You know, Trump said that windmills cause cancer.
What?
Trump said windmills cause cancer.
You know everything causes cancer nowadays. Meat causes cancer. Freaking breathing air causes cancer now, bro.
That's what I like meat, free, soy-free, dairy,
Green meat, bro.
Last speech. I'll slow down.
Please.
Let me get a freaking.
It's going to be the credibility advantage. It's going to be the Middle East instability advantage, and then it's going to be the deterrence to SAD.
Okay, say it one more time.
Deterrence is not going to be just like one sentence and then you're done with it.
No.
Oh.
I don't understand
That's why that's that word.
Go.
Okay, so credibility advantage, the one about human rights.
Credibility.
The instability.
Alright, I'm gonna collect all of your flows at the end.
Oh, damn, these are terrible.
The very end. Like, what are you gonna do with the flow?
That's
You're
right.
gonna learn.
Overflowing.
Are you the last one?
These flows are terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tyler. Well, we went over the types of arguments, which is more important.
I have no idea what to do.
It's okay, you'll learn. It's a learning process.
Wait, the one AC was so hard to flow. That thing was like.
Do you have a question?
Are you affirmative?
I am affirmative, yes. Does everyone have the order?
Negative.
No.
Everyone's
the order I was
What? What's the order? Yeah. The credibility advantage. Sorry. And then the instability advantage.
Okay.
And then the deterrence to SAD. Yeah.
How do you get the judges?
Yeah. Yep. There's also, I don't know if you'll.
One time I had this judge, he said that we're not allowed to have our phones this time. And then he said he'll time us and like knock on the door at 1 minute, but then he didn't.
And you should.
Somebody went on.
I mean, it is kind of up to judges' preference, but most judges should allow you to have your phones. Otherwise, you can. We can maybe talk about this a little bit more later. There are programs where you can get timers, or you can just buy your own timer. But yes.
You can't play Tetris on my phone.
All right.
Yeah.
Is everyone good?
Yeah.
Okay. On the credibility advantage, they conceded or try or die framing, which means this is how you are going to view all of their arguments on this advantage. It was severely undercovered in the, what was that speech, 2NR, and so that is going to be, that is game over for them. Their only arguments on here is how the credibility, human rights credibility is not only linked to arms sales in Saudi Arabia, but Arguer and 19 evidence, the very first piece of evidence coming out of the 1AC is really good, and it tells you about how the U.S.-backed like arms sales and interventionism in Yemen especially is a huge human rights violations, and that is what you're going to be able to hang your hat on today, because the arms sales that are continuing to go to Saudi Arabia are going to striking civilians in Yemen and creating this famine in Yemen, and those are all of these huge human rights abuses, which is decking U.S. human rights credibility in the status quo. Their next argument is just saying that that it's going to be inevitable because U.S. credibility is so high, but first, this was a new argument in the 2NR, so you probably shouldn't weigh it anyway. But even if you think this is true, it doesn't matter, because we have shown you how the Saudi-backed like interventions in the arms sales are decking U.S. credibility in the status quo, which means that our impacts are going to outweigh on all three areas: magnitude, time frame, and probability, because the human rights credibility is key to so many things. It's key to allies, it's key to democracy, it's key to prevent these large-scale war like we might be seeing with Iran, which means that we are going to be accessing the best internal link into the Iran scenario on the DISAD, but I'll get to that a little bit more later. And so this is going to solve all the WMD conflict in the region and solve that regional instability, which is going to be what you're voting on. And on the Middle East advantage, we are going to go for the impacts on this advantage, but we are going to go for this as an internal link turn on the DISAD. Our Stein 19 card is where you are really going to be looking. Star this on your flow. It talks about how Iran prolif is uniquely because of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's uniquely because of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The only argument they have on this is that is inevitable, but that's not true. The THAAD agreement can be rolled back after the plan is passed. That is part of the arms sales agreement. They say that rolling back the THAAD sales is bad, but that's not true because it creates instability in the region. We'll talk about that more on the DISAD. Good. It is game over on the DISAD. The thesis of the DISAD is wrong. Deterrence theory is false. They've conceded Stein and 19 from the 1AC. Any American effort to make regional defenses more accessible will invite counter moves by Iran and incentivize missile race and destabilize the region. This is why the plan is key. The AF ceases arms sales to the region, which makes tech less accessible and solves the perception internal link to the DISAD, which is the biggest internal link into the DISAD. It's all deterrence theory is based on perception. They're talking about how if their storyline, if Iran perceives Saudi Arabia and other countries around them as being strong, it will prevent them from attacking. But this is not true because it only makes them want to build up their capabilities. And so they start proliferating their capabilities so that they can match Saudi Arabia. And this creates a huge proliferation in the region, especially by Iran, which is going to destabilize the region. This was all conceded coming out of the 2NR. So you should prefer our evidence on the question of Iran deterrence, because most of their evidence is from 2012. They've conceded the core question on if Iran can keep and they've also conceded the core question on whether or not Iran can keep the Strait open. They're going to go for this economy impact, which doesn't even make any sense. They have read all of this pieces of evidence to you from 2012. Their Rosenfield evidence from 2012 about how Iran can close the Strait. Cool. Even if they win that argument, that does not mean it's going to cause a global economic decline, because they have conceded the core argument that Iran is not going to be able to keep the Strait open after they close it, because there are so many U.S. allies in the region and so many troops in the region that are going to be able to pressure Iran to reopen up the Strait and push them out of the Strait, which means that even if there is a small impact on the global economy, it's not going to be enough to trigger a diversionary war. They say Trump is going to be a unique cause of this, but we have seen Trump isn't going, just because there's like a minimal shock in the global economy. We've seen shocks in the stock markets. We've seen these little shocks since his presidency has been, and we haven't seen him create a diversionary war. So that's why we are going to outweigh, because they have literally no probability. And also all of their evidence talks about how if deterrence theory is true, and that if deterrence theory is true and Saudi Arabia and other allies backed by the US are the key things in deterring Iran, then that's not going to change post-AF. These allies are still going to be backed by the US. We just cease arms sales to them. And so Iran is still not going to strike them, because they know that the U.S. will retaliate against them. And so there's no risk of the DISAD occurring. That's why you vote F.
I'm totally slow.
Proud of you.
Good debate.
Yeah.
Good debate.
I shredded this. I was so
And
and now I'm worried I'm gonna look at it.
I go next.
I mean, I don't know, but I don't like the
Old evidence,
Yeah, we're gonna do
Yo, watch your fatty.
She's not